Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been hesitant to share this for a long time. 72 years to be exact. I'm 96 now, and I figure I don't have much time left to tell what happened. My hunting partner Slim passed on back in '88, so I guess it's up to me to finally get this off my chest. It was November 1951. The Korean War was in full swing, but up in British Columbia, life went on pretty much the same as always. I was 25 then, already with several years of hunting experience under my belt. My buddy Slim Goodell and I had been planning this trip for months, a week-long hunting expedition in the mountains near McBride. I'd been hunting those mountains since I was a teenager. My old man taught me everything I knew about tracking, shooting, and survival in those woods. By 51, I'd spent over 20 years exploring those valleys and ridges. I knew that wilderness better than I knew the streets of my own hometown. We packed all the essentials, rifles, ammunition, tent, food, the works. Our plan was to set up a base camp and then spend each day exploring different valleys for game. Mountain goats were plentiful that year, and we were hoping to bag a couple. The weather forecast warned of possible snow, but nothing we weren't prepared for. The drive to our starting point was uneventful. We parked my old truck at the end of a logging road and hiked about 6 miles into the wilderness before setting up our first camp. The mountains around McBride are something else. Dark pine forests that seem to stretch forever, rocky ridges that cut into the sky, and valleys so deep and quiet you'd think you were the first person to ever set foot there. The first day went exactly as planned. We tracked a mountain goat up a steep ridge, and Slim got a clean shot. It was a big one too, probably close to 300 pounds. We field dressed it right there, keeping about half the meat for immediate use and carefully preparing the other half to hang in a tree near our camp. This was standard practice to keep it safe from bears and other scavengers while we explored. I remember being particularly careful about hanging that meat. We found a sturdy pine about 100 yards from our lean-to shelter, and I climbed up to secure the meat about 15 feet off the ground. Used strong rope, tied it with knots that wouldn't come loose even in high winds. I'd done this dozens of times before without issue. That evening, we cooked some of the fresh meat over our campfire and discussed our plans for the next day. We decided to break camp early and explore a neighboring valley that I'd spotted from the ridge. It looked promising for more game, and we figured we could be back to our current spot by the following afternoon. "What about the meat?" Slim had asked, nodding toward the tree where our prize hung suspended. "It'll be fine," I assured him. 15 feet up, secured with those knots? Nothing's getting to that. We turned in early that night, both of us exhausted from the day's hunt. Our lean-to was simple but effective, just a tarp stretched over a frame of branches, with pine boughs for bedding. Slim complained about the cold, but I reminded him that it wouldn't be the first time we'd slept on frozen ground, and it probably wouldn't be the last. We awoke before dawn, packed our essentials, and headed toward the adjacent valley. It started snowing lightly as we hiked, but nothing serious, just enough to dust the ground. We spent the day exploring the new area, spotted some deer but decided not to shoot. By late afternoon, we'd set up a temporary camp in the new valley. That night, the temperature dropped significantly. I remember waking up several times, adding wood to our small fire to keep from freezing. The snow continued, light but steady. At first light, we packed up again and headed back to our original camp. The hike back took longer than expected because of the snow. About 2 inches had accumulated overnight. It wasn't deep, but it made the footing treacherous in some spots. We were about a quarter-mile from our camp when Slim suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. He was a few steps ahead of me on the trail, and I nearly bumped into him. "Mac," he said quietly, "look at that." I followed his gaze to the ground in front of us. There, clearly visible in the fresh snow, was a set of footprints. Not animal tracks, at least not like any animal I'd ever seen in 20 years of hunting those mountains. They looked human, barefoot human, except they were enormous. I knelt down to examine them more closely. Each print was easily 15, 16 inches long, with what appeared to be 5 toes clearly defined at the front. The stride between them was massive, at least 4 feet. "What the hell made these?" Slim whispered, his breath fogging in the cold air. I didn't answer because I honestly had no idea. Bear tracks I knew, cougar, wolf, elk, all familiar to me. But these were something else entirely. "They're fresh," I said instead, touching the edge of one print. The snow around the depression was still loose, not yet crusted over. Minutes old, not hours. A chill ran up my spine that had nothing to do with the November cold. Whatever had made these tracks was close, very close. We followed the tracks, our rifles now at the ready. They led straight to our camp. As we approached the lean-to, I felt my stomach tighten. The tracks went right up to our shelter, and then, this is the part that still haunts me, there was an area where the snow was compacted in a roughly human-shaped depression, like something had lain down there. "Jesus Christ," Slim muttered. "Something slept in our camp." The lean-to itself was undisturbed, but there were more tracks leading away from it. They headed in the direction of the tree where we'd hung our meat. With growing dread, we followed them. When we reached the pine tree, I immediately looked up, already knowing what I would see. The meat was gone. Completely gone. The rope hung there, still tied to the branch, but the knots I'd used to secure the meat had been untied, not torn or broken, but methodically untied. "How is that possible?" Slim asked, his voice barely audible. "That meat was 15 feet up." I scanned the ground around the tree. No blood, no scraps, no sign of a struggle or feeding. Just those same massive footprints coming and going. "Whatever it was," I said, "it took the time to untie those knots, and it was tall enough to reach 15 feet up." We both went quiet then, the implications sinking in. This wasn't a bear. Bears can climb, sure, but they don't untie knots. They tear through rope with teeth and claws. And the footprints, no bear I'd ever encountered left prints like that. "We should follow the tracks," I said finally, though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to pack up and get the hell out of there. Slim nodded, his face pale. We gathered our rifles and began tracking the creature. The prints led away from our camp, heading up toward a rocky ridge about a mile distant. The stride was consistent, huge, confident steps through the snow. No signs of hurry or concern about being followed. As we tracked, I noticed something else odd. The footprints showed no signs of slipping or struggling in the snow. Whatever made them moved with perfect balance and surety, even on steep or uneven ground. We followed the trail for about a mile, up toward the ridge. Then, abruptly, the tracks disappeared. Not gradually, like something veering off into different terrain, but suddenly, as if whatever we were tracking had simply vanished into thin air. We found ourselves standing on a rocky outcropping, scanning the ground in all directions for any sign of where the creature had gone. "It's like it just flew away," Slim said, voicing what I was thinking. We spent another hour searching the area, but found nothing. No more tracks, no disturbances in the snow or rocks, no sign at all that anything had passed that way. Finally, by mutual unspoken agreement, we headed back to camp. Neither of us mentioned what we were both thinking, that we should leave, that we should pack up and get out of those mountains as quickly as possible. But as we walked, I could feel Slim's unease matching my own. Back at camp, we silently began gathering our gear. Our week-long hunting trip, so carefully planned, was now the furthest thing from our minds. All I wanted was to be back in my truck, driving on a proper road, surrounded by evidence of civilization. As I rolled up the tarp from our lean-to, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on the pine boughs where we'd slept, was a single long dark hair. It was at least 10 inches in length, coarser than human hair, but definitely not from any animal I recognized. I showed it to Slim, who took it between his fingers, examining it with a frown. "What the hell, Mac?" he whispered. I pocketed the hair, though I can't say why. Evidence, perhaps, of what we'd encountered. Something to prove to ourselves later that we hadn't imagined the whole thing. We packed up in record time and began the 6-mile hike back to the truck. Neither of us spoke much. What was there to say? We'd both seen those tracks. We'd both seen the empty rope, the knots untied. We both knew that something inexplicable had visited our camp, slept in our shelter, and taken our meat without leaving so much as a drop of blood behind. The hike out seemed to take forever. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush made us jump. I kept my rifle ready the entire time, though I'm not sure what good it would have done against something that could reach 15 feet up and untie complex knots. When we finally reached the truck, the relief was palpable. We threw our gear in the back and got in, both of us releasing long breaths as I turned the key in the ignition. The drive back to McBride was tense and quiet. It wasn't until we stopped at a diner on the edge of town that Slim finally broke the silence. "You ever seen anything like that before, Mac? In all your years hunting those mountains?" I shook my head. "Never. Not tracks like that. Not anything that could untie knots and take meat from that height without leaving a trace." We were drinking coffee, trying to warm up and settle our nerves, when an older hunter at the next table leaned over. "Couldn't help overhearing," he said. "You boys ran into something strange up in the mountains?" We exchanged glances, then I nodded. "Big tracks in the snow, like a barefoot man, but huge. Whatever it was took our meat right out of a tree." The old hunter's face went serious. "You're the second group this month. Cooper and his boys came back 2 weeks ago with a similar story. Same area?" "Near Rainbow Ridge," I confirmed, naming the general region where we'd been hunting. He nodded slowly. "Same place. Cooper said they found tracks around their camp one morning, 16 inches long. Their food cache was raided too." "Did they see anything?" Slim asked. The old hunter shook his head. "Just the tracks. But they heard something the night before. Said it sounded like wood knocking on wood. 3 distinct knocks, then silence. We hadn't heard anything like that, but the confirmation that others had experienced something similar sent a new wave of unease through me. "What do you think it was?" I asked. The old hunter shrugged. "Indians around here have stories. A wild man of the mountains. Taller than any normal man, covered in hair. They call it Sasquatch." I'd heard the legends, of course. Most people who spent time in the British Columbia wilderness had. But they were just that. Legends. Ghost stories told around campfires. Or so I'd always thought. "You believe in that sort of thing?" Slim asked the old hunter. 20 years ago, I'd have said no," he replied. "Now? I'm not so sure. Too many stories from too many reliable people." We finished our coffee and left soon after. Before parting ways with Slim, I showed him the long hair I'd found in our lean-to. We examined it together in the dim light of my truck cab. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. I honestly didn't know. What could I do? Take it to the police? They'd laugh me out of the station. A university, perhaps. But what would I say? That I believed it came from some mythical mountain creature? In the end, I kept that hair in a small envelope in my desk drawer for decades. I still have it. Sometimes, when the memory of that day grows dim, I take it out and look at it, reminding myself that what we experienced was real. Slim and I never went back to that part of the mountains. We hunted together for many more years, but always in different areas. We rarely spoke about what happened that November day, but I know it affected him as deeply as it did me. I've read about similar encounters over the years. The descriptions are always eerily familiar. Massive footprints, food taken from seemingly secure locations, a sense of being watched by something intelligent but not quite human. I don't know what we tracked through the snow that day in 1951. I can't explain how it reached our meat, how it untied those knots, or how its tracks simply vanished at that rocky ridge. All I know is that in 20 years of hunting those mountains, I'd never encountered anything like it before, and in the years that followed, I made damn sure I never would again. Story 2. I still can't explain what happened that day, even after all these years. It's been eating at me since 1951, and I figured maybe writing it down might help make sense of it. I've never told the full story to anyone outside my community. I was 19 then, working with my father, Chief William Morris, in our small community of Clam Bay on Swindle Island. If you've never heard of it, I'm not surprised. It's pretty isolated north of Vancouver Island along the BC coast. Most folks who lived there were either fishermen or worked in the small lumber operation on the western side. That morning in May started like any other. It was cold. The kind of damp cold that sinks into your bones, even though spring was supposedly here. Dad woke me before sunrise around 4:30 a.m. We needed to check our fishing nets in the bay before heading inland to Lake Kitasoo, where we had set more nets the previous evening. "Come on, Leonard," Dad said, shaking my shoulder. "Tide's right." I remember pulling on my wool sweater, still half asleep. Mom had left some bannock on the table, which I grabbed as we headed out. The sky was just starting to lighten, that strange blue-grey that comes before proper dawn. The air smelled like it always did, salt, pine, and that muddy seaweed scent that comes with low tide. Our little boat was where we'd left it, pulled up on the rocky beach. As we pushed it into the water, I noticed how still everything was. No wind at all. The water in the bay looked like black glass. We checked our nets quickly that morning. Just a few salmon and a decent-sized halibut, enough to bring back to the community, but not enough to feel satisfied. Dad suggested we head to Lake Kitasoo right away to check the other nets. Usually we would have headed back with our catch first, but something was different that day. Dad seemed restless, like he could feel something in the air I couldn't yet sense. The walk to Lake Kitasoo took about 40 minutes, following a narrow path through dense forest. The trees were so thick they blocked out most of the morning light, making it feel like dusk, even though the sun was rising. We didn't talk much during the walk. Dad was always quiet in the mornings, and I was still trying to wake up properly. When we reached the sandbar that stretches along the eastern edge of Lake Kitasoo, I noticed Dad had stopped walking. He was standing completely still, staring down at the ground. At first I thought maybe he'd spotted a snake or something, but when I got closer, I saw what had caught his attention. There were footprints in the wet sand, human-looking footprints, but with no shoe marks, just bare feet. They came from the forest, crossed the sandbar, and went straight into the lake. "Dad," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet morning. He didn't respond at first, just crouched down to examine the prints more closely. I joined him, and that's when I noticed something that made my skin prickle. The tracks weren't all the same size. Most were maybe 9-10 inches long, bigger than a child's but not massive. But every few prints, there was one that was enormous, at least 14 inches, maybe more. "What made these?" I asked, even though I already knew Dad wouldn't have a concrete answer. "Not sure," he said quietly, "but look at the direction. They're heading into the lake." That's when I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Lake Kitasoo was fed by mountain streams and remained ice-cold year-round. Even in summer you couldn't swim for more than a few minutes without your muscles seizing up. And these tracks, whatever made them, had walked straight into that water in May when the lake would be practically freezing. "Should we follow them?" I asked, already knowing what Dad would say. He nodded. "We need to see where they go." We followed the shoreline, our nets temporarily forgotten. The lake was roughly oval-shaped, about a mile across at its widest point. As we walked, I kept looking out at the still, dark water, half expecting to see something surface. The thought made my heart beat faster. We'd gone about a quarter mile when Dad stopped again, pointing to the water's edge. There were more tracks, but these were coming out of the lake. Whatever had gone in on one side had come out here. And again, there was that same pattern, mostly medium-sized prints, with the occasional much larger one mixed in. It's like, I started to say, but couldn't finish the thought. Like a family, Dad completed my sentence. Different ages, walking together. We followed these new tracks as they led away from the lake and into the forest. They weren't heading toward any path or trail I knew of, just straight into the dense underbrush where few people ever went. Dad looked concerned now. "We should get Sarah," he said. Sarah Thompson was an elder in our community, probably in her 70s then. If anyone would know what to make of this, it would be her. We hurried back to Clam Bay, forgetting our fishing nets entirely, which wasn't like Dad at all. When something made him forget about fishing, it was serious. Sarah was already up when we reached her small house at the edge of the village. She took one look at our faces and invited us in without a word. Dad explained what we'd found while I sat nervously by the wood stove, warming my hands. "The wild people," Sarah said simply after Dad finished. "The what?" I asked. Sarah looked at me with those dark eyes that always seemed to see more than other people's. "The wild people. They've lived in the interior of the island since before my grandmother's time. Most people call them something else now. Sasquatch." I'd heard stories about Sasquatch, of course. Everyone growing up in these parts had, but they were just that, stories. Ghost tales told around fires. But the way Sarah said it, so matter-of-fact, made my mouth go dry. "They don't usually come so close," she continued. "They stay deep in the mountains, away from us. Something must have changed." Dad nodded slowly. "Will you come look?" he asked Sarah. She agreed, and within 30 minutes, the three of us were making our way back to Lake Kitasoo. More people were awake in the village now, but we didn't tell anyone else what we were doing. Dad had that look that meant he wanted to understand something before spreading word. The tracks were still there when we returned, although the rising sun was drying the sand, making them less distinct. Sarah examined them carefully, measuring one of the largest prints against her own hand. Her hand barely covered half the length. "The big one is the father," she said confidently. "These smaller ones are the mother and children." "How do you know?" I asked. "The weight distribution. See how deep the heel sinks. That's a male. The others press more evenly." We followed the tracks again, this time all the way to where they disappeared into the forest on the far side. Sarah moved with surprising agility for her age, never hesitating even when the ground became uneven or steep. At the forest edge, we paused. The tracks led into an area of the island I'd rarely visited, a dense section of old-growth forest that eventually gave way to the more mountainous interior. Dad looked at Sarah, a question in his eyes. "We should follow," she said, but quietly. The forest was different here. Older somehow. The trees were massive, their roots creating a maze across the ground that we had to carefully navigate. The tracks remained visible in patches of soft earth, though they were harder to follow on the carpet of pine needles and moss. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when I heard it, a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. It was a call or cry, but unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite human, not quite animal. It started low and rose in pitch, echoing through the trees. Then it was answered by a similar cry, but higher, maybe female or younger. Dad froze. Sarah put a hand on his arm, signaling for complete silence. We stood there barely breathing, for what felt like forever. Then we heard movement ahead, branches snapping, the rustle of undergrowth. It sounded big, much bigger than a deer or even a bear, and it was moving fast. "We need to go," Sarah whispered so quietly I barely heard her. "Now, back to the lake." We turned and started moving, trying to be quiet but prioritizing speed. I kept wanting to look back, but something told me that would be a mistake. The sounds continued behind us, sometimes seeming to pace us, sometimes moving perpendicular to our path. We were maybe halfway back to the lake when I caught a glimpse of movement to my right. Just a flash of dark brown between the trees, but it was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen. I opened my mouth to say something, but Dad gripped my arm hard, shaking his head. When we finally broke through the trees back onto the sandbar, I felt like I could breathe again. We stood there for a moment, all three of us scanning the forest edge. "They won't come out into the open," Sarah said. "Not while we're here watching." "What do they want?" I asked, my voice sounding strange and tight. Sarah shook her head. "They don't want anything from us. They're just living same as we are. This is their home too." We made our way back to the village, and by unspoken agreement, didn't mention what had happened to anyone else that day. But word got out anyway. It always does in small communities. By evening, several other people had gone to see the tracks, and someone mentioned that their cousin had seen similar prints on the north side of the island a few years back. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept hearing that cry in my head and seeing that brief glimpse of movement in the trees. Dad was restless too. I could hear him getting up multiple times, probably to look out the window. The next morning, more people from our community went to Lake Kitasoo to see the tracks. But a light rain had fallen overnight, and while the prints were still visible, they were less distinct. Some of the younger men wanted to form a search party to track whatever had made the prints deeper into the forest, but Dad and Sarah convinced them not to. "Some things are best left undisturbed," Sarah told them. A few days later, a non-native anthropologist named Dr. Rebecca Sullivan arrived from Vancouver. Someone had contacted her about the tracks, though no one would admit to being the one who'd done it. She took photos and measurements, interviewed everyone who'd seen the tracks, and seemed particularly interested in my account of what I'd glimpsed in the forest. "Could it have been a bear standing up?" she asked me for the third time. "No," I said firmly. "It wasn't a bear. It was upright, walking on two legs naturally, and it was tall, really tall." She made notes and asked if we'd heard any unusual sounds. When I described the calls we'd heard, she became very excited and asked if I could imitate them. I couldn't, or wouldn't. Something about that sound felt private, not meant for casual reproduction. Dr. Sullivan stayed for nearly 2 weeks, setting up recording equipment near the lake and spending long hours in the forest. She never managed to capture anything on her recordings other than normal forest sounds, though she claimed to have heard the cries herself one night. Before she left, she had a long conversation with Sarah. I wasn't privy to all of it, but I overheard Sarah saying, "They've always been here. They were here before us, and they'll be here after us." After Dr. Sullivan departed, things in Clam Bay gradually returned to normal. The excitement over the tracks faded as people returned to their daily routines of fishing, hunting, and preparing for the coming summer. But things were never quite the same for me. I found myself listening more intently to the forest sounds at night. Sometimes, when the wind was right, I thought I could hear those calls again, drifting down from the interior of the island. Dad and I never discussed what we'd seen that day. Not really. But sometimes, when we were out in the boat or walking the forest paths, he would stop suddenly and listen, his head tilted slightly. I knew he was listening for them too. I left Swindle Island a few years later, moving to Vancouver for work. But I've returned many times over the decades, and I always take a walk to Lake Kitasoo when I do. I've never seen tracks like that again, and I've never caught another glimpse of whatever moved through the trees that day. But sometimes, standing on that same sandbar in the early morning, I get the distinct feeling I'm being watched. And I know, deep down, that they're still there, the wild people of Swindle Island, moving silently through their territory, crossing the lake when they need to, living their lives parallel to ours but separate. The older folks in Clam Bay don't talk about the tracks much anymore. Most of them who remember that day are gone now. Sarah passed away in the late 1970s, and Dad followed a few years later. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the only one left who remembers exactly what happened that morning in May 1951. I still don't know what to make of it all. Were they really Sasquatch? Some unknown tribe of people? Something else entirely? All I know for certain is what I saw and heard that day, and the way it changed how I understand the wilderness around us. Some places still hold mysteries, even in this modern world where everything seems explored and explained. And sometimes on very quiet nights, I still dream of those tracks leading into the cold, dark waters of Lake Kitasoo, and whatever made them, moving silently beneath the surface, emerging on the other side to disappear into the ancient forest beyond. Story 3. I've kept this to myself for far too long. Even after all these years, my hands still shake when I think about what happened that evening in '52. I'm not a man who scares easily, never have been. Fought in the war, ran my own business for 25 years, raised 3 kids, but what I saw that evening on the highway outside Terrace changed something in me. It was early October, salmon run season. I'd spent the weekend at my usual spot on the Skeena, about 20 miles east of town. The fishing had been decent, not great, but I'd caught enough to justify the trip. Had 5 good-sized silvers in my cooler. I'd stayed later than I meant to. You know how it is when you keep thinking, just one more cast, until suddenly the sun's hanging low. I packed up my gear around 5:30 and loaded everything into my Chevy. It was that peculiar time of evening when the light plays tricks on you, not quite dark, but getting there fast. The kind of half-light that makes everything look a little strange. The forest seemed to close in on both sides of the highway, and there wasn't another car in sight. I'd been driving for maybe 15 minutes, smoking a cigarette with the window cracked, thinking about nothing in particular. The road curved gently through the pines, and I was making good time. I figured I'd be home by 7, just in time for dinner. Martha always kept a plate warm for me when I went fishing. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought someone was standing at the edge of the road, maybe a hitchhiker or a local whose car had broken down. But as I got closer, something felt wrong. The proportions weren't right. This figure was too tall, too broad in the shoulders to be a normal man. It was standing perfectly still just beyond the gravel shoulder, partially obscured by the shadow of a large cedar. I slowed down instinctively. Any other day I might have kept driving, but something made me ease off the gas. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else, some primal part of my brain recognizing that what I was seeing wasn't normal. As my headlights swept across it, I realized this was no man. The figure stood at least 7 feet tall, probably closer to 8, and was covered in dark, matted hair. Not fur exactly, more like very long hair, dark brown or black. It was hard to tell in the fading light, but what struck me most was its posture. It was standing completely upright, not hunched like a bear. Its arms hung at its sides, longer than a human's should be. I eased the car to a stop about 30 feet away. The engine idled roughly. I remember that detail so clearly. My hands were locked on the steering wheel, and the cigarette had burned down between my fingers without me noticing. For what felt like forever, neither of us moved. It just stood there, watching me through the windshield. I couldn't make out its face clearly. The light was too poor, and its features were obscured by hair. But I could feel its eyes on me. Not like an animal's gaze, which passes over you without recognition. This thing was studying me with intelligence. Every instinct told me to floor it, to get away as fast as possible, but I couldn't move. It wasn't fear exactly, though God knows I was afraid. It was more like I was transfixed, like we were sizing each other up. After maybe 30 seconds of this standoff, the creature turned slowly away from the road. Its movements were smooth, deliberate, nothing like the awkward lumbering of a bear on its hind legs. It walked with purpose, with a gait that was disturbingly human, yet not quite right, too fluid, too powerful. It moved toward the tree line, about 15 yards from the road's edge. Just before it reached the dense underbrush, it stopped and turned back toward me. Even now, I get goosebumps remembering this moment. It looked directly at me, and I swear I felt something pass between us, some kind of understanding or acknowledgement. Then it simply stepped into the brush and disappeared. The whole encounter couldn't have lasted more than a minute, but time felt stretched, distorted. When it was finally gone, I realized I'd been holding my breath. My shirt was soaked with sweat, and my heart was hammering against my ribs. I sat there for another minute or two, engine still running, trying to process what I'd seen. It wasn't a bear. I'd been hunting and fishing in these woods my whole life and knew bears better than most. It wasn't a man in a costume. The movements were too natural, too fluid. And who the hell would be out here in the middle of nowhere playing pranks? Eventually, I put the car in gear and drove on, constantly checking my mirrors. The rest of the drive back to Terrace passed in a blur. I couldn't stop replaying the encounter in my mind, second-guessing what I'd seen. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd almost convinced myself it had been a trick of the light, or maybe a large black bear that just looked unusual from that angle. Martha knew something was wrong the moment I walked in. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. She kept asking what had happened, if I'd had an accident. I brushed it off, said I was just tired from the long day. I couldn't bring myself to tell her, couldn't stand the thought of seeing that look on her face, the one that says she's worried about my sanity. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing by the roadside, watching me with those unsettlingly intelligent eyes. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it had been nothing, just my imagination playing tricks in the half-light, but the memory was too vivid, too detailed. I knew what I'd seen. I went downtown to open my hardware store like any normal Tuesday. Around mid-morning, Bill Peterson came in looking for some pipe fittings. We got to talking, and somehow the conversation drifted to strange sightings in the woods. That's when he mentioned his wife Emma had seen something unusual back in June, while picking berries near the river. My blood ran cold when he described it, a tall, hairy figure watching her from the trees. She'd dropped her basket and run all the way back to their truck. Bill had laughed it off at the time, told her it was probably just a bear. I didn't tell him about my experience then, but later that week I heard Frederick Johnson, who ran the gas station on Main Street, talking about something similar he'd spotted in early spring while checking his trap lines. That weekend, I drove out to Kitsum Village and spoke with Joseph Williams, an elder I'd known for years through business dealings. We sat outside his home, overlooking the river, and I finally told someone what I'd seen. Joseph didn't seem surprised. He nodded slowly and lit his pipe. Then he told me stories that had been passed down through generations about the tall ones who lived deep in the mountains. The Tsimshian people had always known they were there, he said. They mostly kept to themselves, but were sometimes seen during salmon season when they came down to the rivers to fish. They're not dangerous if you don't threaten them, Joseph told me. They're just people of a different kind. They were here long before us, and they'll be here long after we're gone. When I asked why more people didn't see them, he just smiled. Maybe they don't want to be seen. Maybe most people aren't really looking. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself driving that same stretch of highway more often than necessary, always around dusk, always scanning the tree line. I never saw it again, but sometimes, when the light was just right and the forest was quiet, I'd get that same feeling, like I was being watched by something intelligent from just beyond the trees. I've never told this story publicly before. Back then, a businessman with a reputation to maintain couldn't go around talking about giant hairy creatures in the woods without being labeled a drunk or a lunatic. Even now, most people would probably think I imagined it or exaggerated a bear sighting, but I know what I saw. That was 71 years ago now. I'm an old man, and most of the people who might remember those stories, Emma, Frederick, Joseph, are long gone. Terrace has grown, the forests have receded, and the quiet stretches of highway, where you could drive for miles without seeing another soul, are fewer and farther between. But I still think about that encounter every time I drive past that spot. The way it stood there, so still and yet so aware. The deliberate way it turned to look at me one last time before disappearing into the underbrush. The intelligence in its gaze. Sometimes I wonder if it remembers me too. If somewhere deep in those mountains, that creature, older now, like me, sometimes thinks about the strange human it encountered on the roadside all those years ago. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I just needed to finally put this down in writing to make some record of what happened before I'm gone, because it was real. Whatever it was, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, one of Joseph's tall ones, it was real. And for a brief moment on that October evening in 1952, our worlds touched. When I close my eyes at night, I can still see it standing there at the edge of the forest, looking back at me. And I still wonder what it might have said if either of us had found the courage to cross that gap between our worlds. But the moment passed, as moments do. It returned to its world, and I to mine, each of us carrying the memory of something impossible, yet undeniably real. Story 4. I've been going back and forth about whether to post this for a long time. It's been nearly 70 years, and I'm an old man now. But I remember that day like it was yesterday. I've never been able to explain what I saw. Maybe writing it down will help me process it, I don't know. It was September 1953, and I was 26 years old. Me and two buddies, Marcus and Greg, decided to go camping up near the Oyster River outside Courtenay on Vancouver Island. We'd been planning this trip for months. We all worked at the same lumber mill and desperately needed a break from the daily grind. We were all experienced outdoorsmen, having grown up in the area and knew the woods pretty well. Or so I thought. We'd set up camp earlier that day about a half-mile from the river. It was late afternoon, maybe around 5 or so, and I'd gone off by myself to gather some more firewood while Marcus and Greg set up the rest of our gear. The weather was perfect. Not too hot, not too cold, with this crisp autumn feeling in the air. The salmon was spawning that time of year, which is why we picked that spot. We were planning to do some fishing the next day. I remember walking along this old, overgrown logging road. It hadn't been used in years, just a narrow dirt path with weeds growing through it. The forest was thick on both sides, with these massive Douglas firs towering overhead. Being September, the light was starting to get that golden quality as the sun began its descent. You know that feeling when the forest gets really quiet and all you can hear are your own footsteps? That's how it was. I'd gathered a decent armful of wood and was heading back to camp when I spotted something about 200, maybe 300 yards ahead of me on the logging road. At first, it was just a dark shape, and my initial thought was that it was Marcus or Greg coming to look for me. I called out, "Hey, I got the wood," but got no response. The figure didn't move. It was just standing there in the middle of the path. I remember feeling a bit annoyed, thinking one of my buddies was playing a joke on me. So I started walking straight toward it, still calling out. As I got closer, maybe 150 yards away, I realized something wasn't right. This wasn't Marcus or Greg. It was too big, too dark, and it was standing completely still in a way that didn't seem normal. I slowed down but kept walking. My heart started beating faster, but I told myself it was probably just a bear standing on its hind legs. We'd seen bears before, though usually they run off when they hear humans approaching. At about 100 yards, I stopped dead in my tracks. What I was looking at wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. This thing was massive, standing completely upright like a man, but much taller. It was entirely covered in dark, almost black hair. The hair wasn't like fur exactly, it was longer, shaggier, especially around the shoulders. I dropped the firewood. I didn't even realize I'd done it until I heard the sticks clatter on the ground. That sound seemed to alert the creature. It turned its head toward me, and I swear to God, we made eye contact. I couldn't see its face clearly at that distance, but I could tell it had a flat, almost human-like face, not a snout like a bear. Its eyes caught the late afternoon sunlight, and they looked intelligent. That's the only word I can use to describe it. Not animal eyes. Something else. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it turned fully toward the forest to my right, and walked, not ran, but walked deliberately into the trees. It moved with this smooth, powerful gait, completely upright on two legs. No animal I know walks like that. As it disappeared into the tree line, I could hear it moving through the underbrush, snapping branches, rustling leaves. The sound faded as it moved deeper into the forest. I stood there paralyzed for I don't know how long. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. The creature's height had been incredible. Where it had been standing, there were branches overhanging the logging road at about 9 feet high, and this thing's head nearly touched them. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, probably taller. Eventually, I snapped out of it and realized I needed to get back to camp. I left the firewood where I'd dropped it and practically ran the rest of the way back. My hands were shaking, and I was breathing hard when I burst into our campsite. Marcus and Greg were setting up the cooking gear when I stumbled in. They took one look at me and knew something was wrong. "Jesus, Jack, you look like you've seen a ghost," Marcus said, standing up. I was out of breath and probably sounded like a lunatic as I tried to explain what I'd seen. There was something huge on the logging road, walking on 2 legs, not a bear, not a man. Greg laughed, thinking I was pulling their leg. "Right, and I saw Bigfoot taking a piss behind that cedar over there." "I'm serious," I insisted. "This wasn't normal. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in hair. It looked at me." Marcus frowned. "You sure it wasn't just a bear? They stand up sometimes." "I know what a bear looks like," I snapped. "This wasn't a bear. It walked away on 2 legs, deliberately, like a person." They exchanged that look people give when they think you've lost your mind, but I was determined to prove what I'd seen. "Come with me. I'll show you where it was." Maybe it was the wild look in my eyes, or the fact that I'd never been one for tall tales, but they agreed to follow me back to the spot. The sun was getting lower now, and the forest was growing darker, but I led them down the logging road to where I'd dropped the firewood. "Here," I said, pointing to the scattered sticks. "This is where I was when I saw it." Greg picked up some of the wood. "Well, you definitely dropped this in a hurry." I pointed down the path. It was standing right about there, near where that path narrows by the big cedar. We walked to the spot cautiously. I half expected the creature to appear again, but the forest was quiet. When we reached the place where it had stood, Marcus noticed something on the ground. "Jack," he said slowly, "look at this." There, in a patch of soft earth, was a footprint. Not a bear print, not a human print, but something else entirely. It was huge. I'd guess about 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toe impressions. The impression was deep, suggesting whatever made it was extremely heavy. Greg crouched down to examine it, his skepticism visibly fading. "What the hell made this?" We found more prints leading into the forest, exactly where I'd seen the creature disappear. And looking up at the tree line, we could see freshly broken branches and disturbed vegetation about 7 to 8 feet off the ground. Marcus whistled low. Something big definitely came through here. We followed the trail of broken branches and footprints for about 50 yards into the forest before the signs disappeared in the rocky terrain. By then, the light was failing, and none of us was eager to be in those woods after dark. That night around the campfire, we barely spoke. Each of us was lost in thought, trying to make sense of what we'd found. I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes, so aware, so present. The next morning, none of us mentioned going fishing as we'd planned. Instead, we packed up camp early and headed back to town. The encounter had cast a shadow over our trip that none of us could shake. When we got back to Courtenay, I couldn't let it go. I had to know if anyone else had seen something similar. I remembered an old-timer named Thomas Campbell who worked in the forestry service. He'd been in those woods his entire life, so if anyone would know something, it would be him. I found him at the local diner a few days later and worked up the courage to tell him what I'd seen. I expected him to laugh or dismiss me, but instead he got real quiet and serious. "You saw it up by Oyster River, you say?" he asked, his weathered face grave. I nodded, and he sighed deeply. "You're not the first, son. Not by a long shot." Campbell told me that stories of a massive, hair-covered creature had been circulating in the Oyster River area for decades. His own grandfather, who'd worked as a guide in the region since the 1890s, had collected numerous accounts from loggers and hunters who'd had similar encounters in that same valley. "My grandpa called it the Guardian of the River," Campbell said. "The local tribes have names for it too, going back hundreds of years. They say it's especially active during salmon spawning season when there's plenty of food." He explained that most people who saw it never spoke about it publicly for fear of ridicule. But among the old-timers who'd spent their lives in those forests, the creature was an accepted, if rarely discussed, presence. Campbell's words gave me a strange sort of comfort. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined it. What I'd seen was something that had been part of those woods long before I was born and would likely be there long after I was gone. In the decades since, I've read everything I could find about similar sightings across the Pacific Northwest. Some people call it Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but those names feel too sensational for what I experienced. What I saw wasn't a monster from a horror movie. It was a living, breathing being that seemed as surprised to see me as I was to see it. I've never gone back to that specific spot on the Oyster River. Not out of fear exactly, but out of respect. That forest was its home long before it was our playground. I'm an old man now, and I've never told this story publicly until today. Marcus passed away in '89, and Greg moved to Ontario in the '70s, so I'm the only one left who remembers that day clearly. I've often wondered if that creature is still out there, or if its children or grandchildren now walk those same forest paths. All I know for certain is what I saw that September afternoon in 1953, a moment when my understanding of the world and what lives in it changed forever. I can still see those intelligent eyes looking back at me across the years, reminding me that there are still mysteries in this world that science hasn't explained. Story 5. I still get goosebumps thinking about last summer. My wife Jennifer and I never expected our volunteer work would turn into whatever that was. I'm writing this down because I need to process it, and maybe someone out there has encountered something similar. For context, I'm Michael Blackwood. Jennifer and I are from Vancouver, and we've always been passionate about archaeology. Nothing professional, just weekend enthusiasts who've taken a few university courses and love history. We'd been invited to help with a community building project on the Eskimo First Nations reservation in northern British Columbia. It was July 1953, and we were thrilled to be welcomed into the community to assist with the foundations for a new gathering space. The weather was unusually hot that summer. I remember waking up early on our third day there, sweat already beading on my forehead despite the morning hour. We were staying in a small cabin loaned to us by the community. That morning, Jennifer was particularly excited, since we'd be starting the main excavation for the foundation. "Do you think we'll find anything interesting today?" she asked while we ate breakfast. I laughed it off. We weren't there as archaeologists, just volunteers with shovels. Probably just dirt and rocks, Jen, I replied, if only I'd known. We arrived at the site around 7 a.m. Several community members were already there, including Elder Thomas Windwalker, who had become something of a guide for us. Thomas was in his 70s, with deep-set eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom. He always made us feel welcome, while maintaining a certain formality that commanded respect. The excavation area had been marked out the previous day, a roughly rectangular space about 40 by 60 feet, where the new building would stand. We were divided into teams, and Jennifer and I were assigned to the northeast corner, working alongside two young men from the community, Robert and Daniel. The first few hours were uneventful, just digging, moving dirt, wiping sweat, and drinking water. By midday, we'd made decent progress, reaching about 3 feet down in most areas. The soil was mostly clay with some rocky patches, making the work physically demanding. It happened just after our lunch break. I was digging near the corner of our section when my shovel hit something solid. Not unusual. We'd been hitting rocks all morning. But this one felt different. There was a dull, hollow sound that rocks don't typically make. "Hey, I think I found something," I called out to Jennifer, who was working a few feet away. "Another rock?" she asked, not looking up. "No, feels different." I knelt down and began carefully scraping away the soil with my trowel, a habit from our amateur archaeology days. As I cleared more dirt, I realized I was uncovering something smooth and curved. My first thought was that it might be an old pipe or possibly a piece of pottery. But as more of it became visible, a strange feeling washed over me. The object was yellowish-white, with a distinctive organic texture. It looked familiar in the most unsettling way. "Jennifer," I said, my voice suddenly hushed, "come look at this." She must have heard something in my tone because she immediately put down her shovel and came over. As she knelt beside me, her expression changed from curiosity to confusion. "Is that—" she whispered. We both kept digging, more carefully now, using our hands more than tools. Within 20 minutes, we had exposed enough of the object that there was no denying what we were looking at: a bone. But not just any bone. It was massive and unmistakably shaped like a human lower leg and foot. The proportions were perfect, the distinctive curve of a tibia widening at what would be the ankle, then extending into what was clearly a foot structure with what appeared to be toe bones. But the scale was impossible. The bone section we'd uncovered was already over 3 feet long, and we couldn't see where it ended. My hands were trembling. Jennifer had gone completely silent, her face pale despite the heat. We looked at each other, neither wanting to be the first to say what we were thinking. Robert noticed our stillness and came over. When he saw what we'd uncovered, he froze. Without a word, he turned and ran to get Elder Thomas. Within minutes, the entire work crew had gathered around our discovery. Thomas approached slowly, his face impossible to read. He knelt down with some difficulty and placed his weathered hand on the exposed bone. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with something I couldn't identify. Then Thomas spoke, his voice quiet but carrying across the now silent excavation site. "The stories are true." I'll never forget those words or the way he said them, not with fear or surprise, but with quiet confirmation, as if he'd been expecting this all along. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Jennifer and I, with our limited archaeological experience, took charge of the excavation. The community leaders decided to continue uncovering whatever we had found, but with extreme care. Someone brought us proper archaeological tools from the tribal office: brushes, smaller trowels, measuring tape. As we worked, Thomas sat nearby on a folding chair someone had brought for him. He watched in silence for a while, then began to speak. "When I was a boy, my grandfather told me stories about the giants," he said. "Not like your fairy tales. These were our history. He said our ancestors once shared these lands with beings that looked like men but stood twice as tall. We kept working as he spoke, gradually revealing more of the massive bone structure. It was definitely anatomically human in design, just enormous. By mid-afternoon, we had uncovered what appeared to be a complete lower leg and foot, measuring nearly 5 feet from what would be the knee joint to the end of the toes. According to our stories, Thomas continued, these giants lived in the mountains. They were covered in thick hair, even on their faces. They were not evil, but they were territorial. One came down from the mountains long ago, threatening our village. Our ancestors had no choice but to defend themselves. I remember looking up from our work at this point, meeting Thomas's gaze. His expression was unreadable. They killed it, he said simply, and buried it here. A chill ran through me despite the heat. Jennifer and I exchanged glances. We'd heard stories of Sasquatch and similar creatures, but had always considered them folklore. Yet here we were, uncovering something that defied explanation. As the day progressed, we documented everything meticulously. Jennifer had brought our camera, and we took dozens of photographs from every angle. I made detailed measurements and sketches in my notebook. The bone was undeniably of the same structure as a human leg and foot, with all the same anatomical features, just at a scale that would put the creature at roughly 12-14 feet tall. The preservation was remarkable. The bone was clearly very old, but the clay soil had protected it well. There was no soft tissue remaining, but the bone itself was intact, with a patina of age that suggested it had been buried for centuries. By late afternoon, a silent tension had fallen over the site. Community members spoke in hushed tones. Several times, I noticed people making what appeared to be protective gestures. A heaviness hung in the air that had nothing to do with the summer heat. As the sun began to lower, Thomas approached us again. He had been in discussions with other elders who had gathered at the site. "We must respect our traditions," he said firmly. "The giant was buried here for a reason. We have seen now that the stories are true, but the dead must rest." I understood immediately what he meant. They wanted us to rebury the remains. Jennifer started to object, her archaeological instincts kicking in. I felt the same pull. This was potentially one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in North America. It could rewrite everything we thought we knew about the continent's prehistoric inhabitants. "Couldn't we at least have a university team come look at it?" Jennifer asked. "This is incredibly important from a scientific perspective." Thomas regarded her thoughtfully. "Your science has its place," he said, "but some knowledge belongs to the earth. This being was laid to rest by our ancestors. We must honor that." After some negotiation, we reached a compromise. Jennifer and I would be allowed to finish our documentation, complete our measurements, take more photographs, even make a plaster cast of a section of the bone. But by sunset, the remains would be reburied with the appropriate ceremonies. We worked frantically for the remaining hours, aware of the ticking clock. I still have the notebook filled with measurements, sketches, and observations. Jennifer's photographs came out remarkably clear, stark evidence of what we'd found. As the sun touched the horizon, we reluctantly stepped back. Several elders, including Thomas, performed a ceremony over the excavation. I didn't understand the words, but the solemnity was unmistakable. Then, with great care, the bone was recovered with soil. That night, back in our cabin, Jennifer and I couldn't sleep. We spread our notes and photographs across the small table, talking in hushed tones about what we'd discovered. "This changes everything, Michael," Jennifer whispered. "If this is real—" "How could it not be real?" I interrupted. "We both saw it, touched it. Dozens of people saw it." I know, she said, "but it's just impossible. A human-like creature of that size shouldn't exist, anatomically speaking. The bone structure would have to be completely different to support that kind of weight. I had no answer for that. We fell into silence, staring at the photographs laid out before us. Something happened around midnight that I still can't explain. We were still at the table when we heard it. A deep reverberating sound from somewhere in the distance. Not quite a howl, not quite a moan. It seemed to come from the mountains to the north. Jennifer grabbed my arm. What was that? I shook my head, trying to rationalize. Probably just wind in the trees or some animal. But it came again, closer this time. The sound had a quality to it that raised the hair on my arms, a loneliness, a grief that seemed almost human. Our eyes met across the table, both recognizing that whatever was making that sound was not something we could explain away. The third time it came, it was close enough that the window seemed to vibrate slightly. Without speaking, I got up and made sure our door was locked. We extinguished the lamp and sat in darkness, listening. The sound came once more, so close it seemed to surround our cabin, then faded. We waited, hearts pounding, but there was nothing more. At first light, we emerged from the cabin, exhausted from a sleepless night. The community was already active, but there was a strange tension in the air. No one mentioned any unusual sounds from the night before, and somehow I couldn't bring myself to ask. We went to check on the excavation site and found that additional soil had been piled on the area where we'd made our discovery. Elder Thomas was there, looking as though he too had not slept. "It would be best if you returned to Vancouver today," he said without preamble. It wasn't unkind, but it was firm. Did something happen last night?" Jennifer asked hesitantly. Thomas regarded us for a long moment. "Some things are better left undisturbed," he finally said. "You have your pictures and your notes. That will have to be enough." We packed our belongings and left that afternoon. The drive back to Vancouver was quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts. We had planned to share our discovery with colleagues at the University of British Columbia, but something held us back. The photographs and notes sat in a folder on my desk for weeks. Eventually, we did share some of our findings with a trusted professor in the archaeology department. His initial excitement turned to skepticism as he examined our evidence. While he admitted the bone structure in the photographs appeared anatomically correct for a human limb, just at an impossible scale, he suggested it might be an elaborate hoax or perhaps the fossilized remains of an unknown megafauna species, misidentified due to coincidental similarities to human anatomy. But Jennifer and I know what we saw. We know how meticulously we documented everything. And sometimes, late at night, I still wake up thinking I hear that sound, that mournful, lonely call echoing from the mountains. The folder with our photographs and notes sits in a safe deposit box now. I don't know if we'll ever share them more widely. Some knowledge, as Elder Thomas said, perhaps belongs to the earth. Story 6. I've never been one for sharing personal stories online, but after all these years, I still can't make sense of what happened to me. It's been nearly 70 years now, but I remember every detail, like it was yesterday. Maybe putting it down in writing will help me process it, or maybe someone out there has seen something similar. It was early October 1955. I was working highways back then in British Columbia. Good, honest work, maintaining roads through some of the most beautiful wilderness you can imagine. I'd been stationed near Tetshorn Cache for about 3 months, and on my days off, I liked to explore Mica Mountain. Being an experienced hunter and trapper since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, I felt comfortable in those woods, comfortable enough to go hiking alone, which is exactly what I was doing that day. The morning started crisp and clear, typical fall weather in BC. I packed light, just my rifle, a Winchester .30-30 that had been my father's, some jerky, water, and a small first aid kit. My plan was simple. hike up to this abandoned mine I'd heard about from the locals. Not for any treasure-hunting nonsense, just curiosity, really. I'd always been fascinated by old mining operations, wondering about the men who'd worked there, what their lives had been like. I set out around 7 a.m., following an old logging trail for the first few miles before cutting northeast through denser forest. The hike was uneventful for the first couple hours, just me, the trees, and occasional wildlife. I spotted a few deer tracks, some squirrels, normal forest residents. The terrain got steeper as I climbed, and I had to stop more frequently to catch my breath. Not as young as I used to be, even back then. By about 11:30, I figured I was maybe a mile from the old mine site. I decided to take a short break, find a good spot to rest my legs before the final push-up. That's when things changed. I was scanning a small clearing ahead when I noticed movement in the bushes about 75 yards away. My first thought was grizzly. We had plenty in the area. I could only see parts of what looked like a dark brown animal through the foliage. I immediately froze and slowly moved my hand to my rifle. Not that I was planning to shoot it unless absolutely necessary. I wasn't looking to kill a bear I couldn't pack out, and I sure as hell didn't want to just wound one. Instead of grabbing my gun right away, I carefully backed up a few steps to a large boulder with a bush in front of it. Perfect natural blind. I settled in behind it, thinking I'd observe the bear for a bit before continuing my hike in another direction. That's when everything I thought I knew about the woods changed forever. The bear moved and suddenly stood upright on two legs. My heart nearly stopped. It stepped forward out of the bushes into a patch of sunlight, and I realized I wasn't looking at any bear. This was something else entirely. It walked upright, just like a human, but was covered in dark brown hair with silver tips that caught the sunlight. From my position, I guessed it stood about 6 feet tall, maybe a bit less. The build was solid but not massive. Strong-looking shoulders, long arms that hung down past its thighs. And it moved with purpose, deliberate steps, not the awkward gait you might expect from an animal trying to walk on hind legs. The creature had no idea I was there, which gave me the chance to really look at it. The hair covered most of its body, thicker in some places than others. It wasn't like fur exactly, more like very long human hair, maybe 3 to 4 inches long in most places. I noticed it was thinner on the face, almost absent around the mouth and nose. Here's where it gets even stranger. The thing walked directly toward where I was hiding, not charging, just walking, like it was headed somewhere specific that happened to be in my direction. I held my breath, pressed myself against that boulder, and prayed it wouldn't detect me. As it got closer, maybe 30 yards away now, I could see more details. The face had a flattened nose, broader than a human's. Its head shape was odd, higher in the back than the front, sloping down to a pronounced brow ridge. The jaw jutted forward slightly, with lips that protruded past the nose. And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. This creature was female. It had breasts, unmistakably so, though they were smaller and covered with fine hair, unlike the thicker coat elsewhere. This wasn't some man in a suit playing a prank. This wasn't any animal I'd ever encountered in all my years in the wilderness. I was looking at something science said didn't exist. The creature kept approaching, completely unaware of my presence. It moved within 20 feet of my position, close enough that I could hear its breathing, deep, steady breaths. It crouched down near a bush with broad leaves and began to pick them, eating them with surprisingly delicate movements of its hands. The hands. God, the hands. They were so human-like it was unsettling. 5 fingers, opposable thumbs, but larger than mine, with thicker, darker nails. It used them to carefully select certain leaves, discarding others, bringing them to its mouth with deliberate motions. From this distance I could see its eyes. Dark brown, almost black, with a depth of intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. The eyes weren't animal eyes. There was something behind them, something thinking, evaluating, considering. I don't know how long I sat there watching it eat. Probably only a minute or two, but it felt like hours. I was afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. My rifle lay across my lap, untouched. I couldn't have raised it if I wanted to. I was completely frozen in astonishment. Then, the worst happened. Maybe I shifted slightly. Maybe the wind changed direction, carrying my scent. Or maybe it just sensed my presence somehow. Whatever the reason, the creature suddenly stopped eating and became completely still. Its head turned slowly, deliberately, until those intelligent dark eyes were looking directly at mine. I'll never forget that moment. Our eyes locked, and what I saw in its face wasn't the mindless aggression of a predator or the dumb curiosity of prey. What crossed its features was unmistakable, human-like amazement. Its eyes widened slightly, its mouth opened just a bit. It was every bit as surprised to see me as I was to see it. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. Neither of us moved. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, and I swear I could hear its breathing change tempo, becoming quicker. Then it slowly stood up from its crouched position. It backed away a few steps, never taking its eyes off me. There was no aggression in its movements, just caution. It straightened to its full height, still watching me, and I finally remembered the rifle on my lap. Almost on instinct, my hands moved to it, raising it slightly. The creature noticed this movement immediately. It turned its body away from me, but kept its head turned, still watching. Then it began walking away, not running in panic, but moving with purpose, quickly putting distance between us. It glanced back twice over its shoulder as it went, as if to make sure I wasn't following. I did raise my rifle then, bringing it up to my shoulder, finger near, but not on, the trigger. I had a clean shot. I was a good marksman. I could have taken it down right there, but I didn't fire. I couldn't. Looking through those iron sights at that retreating figure, all I could think was, this is too human. Whatever I was looking at, it wasn't just some animal. The way it moved, the intelligence in those eyes, the clear decision-making I'd observed, shooting it would have felt like murder. As the creature reached the edge of my clear line of sight about 50 yards away now, it did something that still haunts me. It stopped and turned partly toward me again. It threw its head back slightly and made a sound that I've tried for decades to describe accurately. It wasn't a growl or a roar or any animal sound I'd ever heard. It was something between a laugh and speech, rhythmic, with distinct changes in pitch and tone. Ah-ha-ha, hoo-ah-ha is the closest I can approximate it. It did this twice, the sound echoing slightly in the forest clearing. Then it turned and walked into the denser trees, and within seconds it was gone. I sat there for what must have been 20 minutes, unable to move. My hands were shaking so badly I had to put the rifle down. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. Everything I thought I knew about the natural world had just been thrown into question. Eventually, I got up on unsteady legs. I debated whether to follow the creature, maybe try to get another look, but common sense prevailed. I had no idea what I was dealing with, or if there were more of them. Instead, I decided to carefully examine where it had been. I approached the bush it had been eating from, some kind of mountain huckleberry. There were clear signs where leaves had been plucked, and on the ground I found something that made my skin crawl, a clear footprint pressed into a patch of soft soil. It was about 16 inches long, much wider than a human foot, with 5 distinct toes. The impression was deep, suggesting considerable weight. I didn't have a camera with me, something I've regretted ever since, but I studied that print carefully, committing it to memory. It wasn't a bear track. It wasn't anything I recognized. I abandoned my plan to visit the mine that day. Instead, I made my way back down the mountain, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every snapped twig or rustling bush. By the time I reached my truck, the sun was getting low, and I was mentally exhausted. That night I barely slept. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, questioning what I'd seen. Had it really happened? Was I going crazy? But the image of those intelligent eyes looking into mine was too vivid, too real to dismiss. The next day at work, I considered telling my co-workers, but stopped myself. Who would believe me? I'd be laughed out of the job site, maybe even out of the profession. So I kept quiet, carrying this experience alone. In the following weeks, I returned to the area twice, hoping for another glimpse, but found nothing. No tracks, no signs, nothing. It was as if the creature had never existed except in my mind. Over the years, I've heard stories about Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Some accounts sound similar to what I saw, others wildly different. I've read books, watched documentaries, even attended a conference once, sitting in the back, not participating. I've never publicly shared my story until now. I'm an old man now. I've had a good life, worked hard, raised a family. I've never been one for tall tales or seeking attention, but what I saw that day on Mica Mountain was real. I know it as surely as I know anything. That female creature, that being with intelligent eyes and almost human hands, exists, or at least existed in 1955. I've often wondered what would have happened if I'd tried to communicate with it, or if I'd followed it, or God forbid if I'd shot it. Would we know more about these creatures today? Or would I have never made it off that mountain? All I know is that for a brief moment I looked into the eyes of something science says isn't there, and it looked back at me with what I can only describe as recognition. One intelligent being acknowledging another. That's something I'll carry with me to my grave. Story 7. I've never told this story to anyone outside my immediate family and a few close friends. Even now, nearly 70 years later, my hands shake as I type this. I'm an old man now, but what happened that morning in '56 has stayed with me every day of my life. I was 27 years old then, working as a truck driver hauling timber from the interior to Vancouver. It was decent work, paid the bills, and I enjoyed the solitude of the open road. I'd been doing the route for about 3 years at that point, knew every curve and pothole of the Trans-Canada Highway like the back of my hand. March 30th, 1956. That date is burned into my memory. I'd left Kamloops around 2:30 a.m., which was typical for my schedule. I liked driving through the night when traffic was light and I could make good time. The plan was to reach Vancouver by mid-morning, unload, and get home in time for lunch with my wife. The sky was just beginning to lighten on the eastern horizon as I approached flood. It wasn't truly daylight yet, more of that strange grey time when the world exists in shadows. There was a light fog coming off the Fraser River, nothing unusual for spring in that area. I remember having my high beams on and the wipers going at intervals to clear the mist that kept settling on the windshield. I wasn't tired. That's important to understand. I'd slept well the day before, and I'd stopped for coffee in Kamloops before starting my route. I was alert, focused on the road, maybe even humming along to something on the radio. So what happened next wasn't the result of highway hypnosis or me nodding off. I was doing about 45 to 50 miles per hour, which was a comfortable speed for that stretch. The road curved slightly to follow the river, and as I came around that bend, my headlights caught something moving across the highway. My first thought, and I remember this with perfect clarity, was that someone's grey horse had gotten loose. That's how my brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing. A horse. But it wasn't a horse. I hit the brakes, not slamming them, but firmly enough that I felt the load shift behind me. The figure was in the middle of my lane, and for a split second I was certain I was going to hit it, but it moved with surprising speed, covering the last few feet of asphalt in what seemed like a single stride. As I got closer, still slowing down, I realized what I was looking at couldn't possibly be a horse. It was walking upright on 2 legs. It had to be 7 feet tall at least, covered in grey hair from head to toe. Not fur like a bear. This was different, thinner, more like human hair but longer, and it hung from the creature's body in a way that made me think of pictures I'd seen of orangutans, except this thing was much bigger and the color was all wrong. The creature reached the other side of the road just as I passed by. I swear I could have reached out my window and touched it, that's how close I came. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. I didn't scream or anything dramatic like that. I was too shocked. It was like my brain short-circuited. But here's where it gets even stranger. As I passed the first creature, my eyes flicked to the right side of the road, and there was another one. I'm positive of this. This second one was partially hidden in the bushes that lined the highway. All I could really see clearly was the upper part of its body and its head, just visible above the vegetation. It was standing perfectly still, watching. Watching me? Watching the other one? I don't know. They both had this same greyish-coloured hair. Not the brown or black you'd expect from a bear, and they were tall but lanky. Gangly is the word that came to mind, not bulky like bears. Their proportions were all wrong for bears. Too tall, too narrow through the shoulders. I kept driving. I didn't stop. Why didn't I stop? I've asked myself that question 1,000 times over the years. Part of it was pure instinct, something primal that told me to keep moving. Part of it was practical. I had a schedule to keep and a truck full of timber, but mostly I think I was scared out of my mind. The whole encounter couldn't have lasted more than 10 to 15 seconds. By the time my brain fully processed what I'd seen, I was already a half-mile down the road. I remember checking my mirrors, but there was nothing to see but empty highway fading into the morning mist. I drove the rest of the way to Vancouver in a state of confusion. I kept second-guessing myself. Maybe it was just a couple of bears. Maybe the early morning light and fog had played tricks on my eyes. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen wasn't any animal I was familiar with. When I reached Vancouver and unloaded my truck, I still felt shaken. I mentioned what I'd seen to a couple of other drivers at the yard, but they just laughed it off. One of them joked about me hitting the bottle during my drive, which made me clam up pretty quick. I wasn't a drinker, never had been, but I knew how the story sounded. After completing my paperwork, I went to a diner for some breakfast. I couldn't eat much. My stomach was in knots. While I was sitting there staring at my half-eaten eggs, I made the decision to report what I'd seen to the authorities. Not because I thought they'd do anything about it, but because I felt like I needed to tell someone official to put it on record. The provincial police station was just a few blocks away. I remember walking in there feeling like a complete fool. The officer at the desk looked bored as I started explaining what I'd seen. I was careful to stick to the facts. What time it was, where exactly I'd been, what the visibility was like, and what I'd observed. I didn't use the word Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Those terms weren't as common back then, at least not where I was from. The officer took notes without much interest until I described the creature's appearance. Then he gave me a strange look and asked me to wait. He disappeared into a back room and returned a few minutes later with another officer, an older guy with graying hair and a serious expression. This second officer asked me to repeat my story. When I finished, he nodded slowly and said something that made my blood run cold. "You're not the first to report something strange in that area this week." He explained that a group of loggers working near Flood had come in a few days earlier with reports of unusual noises in the woods at night, not animal sounds they recognized, and large footprints around their camp. The footprints were bipedal but much larger than any human foot. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I wasn't crazy. Others had seen or heard something too. The officer took down my contact information and promised they'd look into it, but I got the sense they were just humoring me. What could they really do? Send out a search party for some mysterious creatures that might or might not exist? When I got home that afternoon, I told my wife everything. She believed me. Or at least, she believed that I believed what I'd seen. That was good enough for me. I needed someone to trust that I wasn't making this up or losing my mind. Over the next few weeks, I heard through the grapevine that my sighting had sparked something of a local sensation. People in the area started calling them the Grey Ones of Flood. Apparently, several groups of curious locals organized weekend expeditions into the woods around Flood, hoping to spot the creatures or find evidence. As far as I know, nobody found anything conclusive. A reporter from a local paper called me, wanting to do a story, but I declined. I'd already heard the whispers and snickers when I walked into the truck yard. "There goes Hunt and his monsters," they'd say. I didn't need that kind of attention. I continued driving that route for another 8 years, and I always slowed down when passing through Flood, especially in the early morning hours. I never saw the creatures again, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't look for them every time. Sometimes, in the years that followed, I'd hear stories about similar sightings in British Columbia. Every now and then, there'd be an article in the paper about giant footprints found in remote areas or hikers reporting strange encounters. Each time I'd feel that same chill run down my spine that I felt that morning in '56. The weirdest part of the whole experience looking back was how ordinary it felt in the moment. There was no dramatic music like in the movies, no sense that I was witnessing something supernatural. It was just something unexpected on an otherwise normal morning, like coming across a moose in your backyard. Surprising and a bit frightening, but not world-shattering. But it did change me. I became more attentive to my surroundings after that, more aware that the world might contain things that defied easy explanation. I started paying attention to stories I would have dismissed before as tall tales or the ramblings of attention seekers. I also developed a strange relationship with that stretch of highway. I never felt comfortable driving it again, especially around dawn, but I found myself looking forward to it in an odd way. There was always this tension in my chest as I approached Flood, a mixture of fear and anticipation. Would I see them again? What would I do if I did? Would I have the courage to stop this time? I still think about what those creatures were doing there that morning. Were they crossing the road to get to the river? Were they migrating somewhere? Were they a family? The way they moved, that purposeful stride, suggested intelligence to me. And the way the second one stood watching from the bushes, it felt deliberate, like it was standing guard while the first one crossed. Over the decades, I've read books and watched documentaries about Sasquatch sightings. Some of the descriptions match what I saw, others don't. The creatures I encountered were definitely grey, not the brown or black that's often reported, and they seemed more slender than the bulky, muscular beings described in many accounts. Maybe they were younger specimens, or maybe they were something else entirely. I'm an old man now, and I've come to terms with the fact that I'll probably never know for sure what I saw that morning. The older I get, the more my memory of other things fades. But that encounter remains crystal clear. The grey early morning light, the mist rising from the river, the sudden appearance of that tall, hair-covered figure crossing the road, and its companion watching silently from the bushes. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, those grey ones of Flood, moving through the forests of British Columbia, staying just out of sight of human civilization. Do they tell stories about their own encounters with strange creatures like me, creatures that hurtle down black rivers of stone in metal boxes, briefly illuminating the night with artificial suns before disappearing again into the darkness? All I know for certain is what I saw that morning in 1956, for those few brief seconds when our worlds intersected. Two beings, not quite human but not quite animal either, crossing a lonely stretch of highway as dawn broke over the mountains. And me, a young truck driver who happened to be in the right place at the right time, or the wrong place at the wrong time, depending on how you look at it. I've never seen anything like them since. Not in all my years on the road. And now, as I share this account for the first time outside my close circle, I still can't explain what those creatures were or where they came from. All I know is what I saw. And what I saw wasn't human, wasn't a bear, wasn't anything I could identify. They were the grey ones of flood. And for one brief moment on a misty March morning, our paths crossed in a way that would change at least one of our lives forever. Story 8. I've been holding this in for so long that it feels strange to finally type it out. I'm still not sure what happened to me that August evening in 1956, but I know what I saw, and I know what I found afterward. I was 34 then, working at the Erie manufacturing plant back in Pennsylvania, and desperately needed a break from the heat, noise, and constant pressure. My doctor had actually recommended I take some time off after my blood pressure spiked during a routine exam, when my old army buddy William Carson wrote to say I could rent a cabin near his place in British Columbia for a decent price. It seemed perfect. A quiet fishing vacation in the Canadian wilderness, just what the doctor ordered, literally. The trip to Seychelles, BC, was long but beautiful. I took the train most of the way, then a series of buses. Will picked me up at the final stop in his beat-up Ford truck. We caught up on the drive to his place, talking about old times and how life had changed. He looked good, tanned, and fit from outdoor work. Not like the rest of us factory guys back in Erie, who were turning pale and soft under the fluorescent lights. The cabin's about a half-mile from my place, Will explained as we bumped down a dirt road. It belongs to Old Man Keller, but he's in Vancouver visiting his daughter all summer. Said I could rent it out if I found someone trustworthy. He glanced over at me and grinned. I told him you were mostly trustworthy. We stopped at Will's house first, a modest but well-kept place at the edge of what barely qualified as a town. His wife Mary made us sandwiches, while Will showed me his workshop where he made custom fishing lures. The whole scene was so peaceful compared to my life back home. No factory whistles, no traffic, just the sound of wind in the pines and distant birdsong. It was getting on toward evening when Will said, "We better get you settled in before dark. I've got the key here, and Mary packed you some basics to get through tonight. Tomorrow, we can drive into town for supplies." We loaded my suitcase and a box of groceries into the truck and drove about 10 minutes down a winding road, then turned onto what was little more than a forest path. "This is as far as the truck goes," Will said, pulling up at the bottom of a sloped gravel driveway that disappeared into the trees. "It's about a quarter-mile walk up to the cabin. I'd drive you, but Keller's particular about his property, says too many vehicles compact the soil or some nonsense." I didn't mind the walk. After being cooped up traveling for days, stretching my legs felt good. Will helped me with the grocery box, and I took my suitcase. The air smelled amazing. Pine and something floral I couldn't identify, mixed with the earthy scent of the forest floor. "Listen, Ed," Will said as we started up the drive, his voice suddenly serious. "There's been some strange business around here lately. Probably nothing, but—" He trailed off. "What kind of strange business?" I asked, already feeling the peaceful mood starting to slip. Will looked uncomfortable. "Just some noises at night. Things moved around outside some of the outlying properties. Probably just teenagers or maybe a bear. But if you hear anything odd, don't go investigating. Just keep the doors locked at night and come get me if you're worried." I nodded, but I was already wondering if this vacation was a mistake. I hadn't come all this way to be locked inside after dark. Will checked his watch. "Look, I promised Mary I'd be back to help with something. The cabin's just up ahead. You can see the chimney through the trees there. Everything's all set up inside. Come down for breakfast tomorrow, say around 7, then we'll go fishing." I was surprised he was leaving so suddenly, but I agreed. Will gave me a quick clap on the shoulder, handed me the cabin key, and headed back down the drive at a pace that seemed unnecessarily quick. I stood watching him go, feeling suddenly very alone as the daylight began to fade. The temperature was dropping, and I decided I'd better get to the cabin before it got completely dark. The drive curved through tall pines, climbing gradually. It was longer than it looked, and I was breathing hard by the time I reached a clearing where the cabin stood. It was a nice place, bigger than I'd expected, with a covered porch and large windows. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard, and I hurried up the porch steps, suddenly eager to be inside. The key worked smoothly, and I pushed the door open to find a cozy, well-kept interior. A main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, 2 doors that presumably led to bedrooms, and another, I guessed, was the bathroom. I set down my suitcase and the box of groceries and walked through the cabin, flipping on lights. Everything was clean and simply furnished, perfect for a quiet getaway. Through the kitchen window, I could see the last orange glow of sunset fading behind the trees. I decided to unpack the groceries and my suitcase before it got completely dark. When I finished putting things away, I realized I'd left my fishing tackle in Will's truck. Annoyed at myself, I decided I'd just have to borrow some of his gear tomorrow. I made a quick sandwich from the supplies Mary had packed, ate standing at the kitchen counter, then went to the porch to have a cigarette before turning in. The night had fully arrived now, and the darkness was profound in a way city people like me rarely experience. No streetlights, no distant glow of civilization, just absolute blackness beyond the small pool of light from the cabin windows. The stars were incredible, though, millions of them, more than I'd ever seen, scattered across the sky like diamond dust. That's when I remembered I'd left my jacket in Will's truck too, and it had my cigarettes in the pocket. Cursing my forgetfulness, I stood there on the porch, trying to decide if I wanted to walk all the way back down to Will's house in the dark. Looking at the pitch-black driveway disappearing into the trees, I decided the cigarette could wait until morning. I was about to go inside when I heard something moving in the woods to my left, maybe 30 yards away. Not small like a squirrel or rabbit, something big that made branches crack. I froze, straining to see into the darkness. Will's warning about bears flashed through my mind, and I edged closer to the door. The sound stopped. I waited, listening intently. Nothing. Must have been a deer, I thought, or maybe just the wind. I went inside and locked the door behind me. I was tired from traveling, but not quite ready for sleep. I found a deck of cards in a drawer and played a few hands of solitaire at the kitchen table, then decided to read for a while in bed. I'd brought a new mystery novel that I'd been saving for the trip. The bedroom was comfortable, with a brass bed and plaid curtains. I changed into my pajamas, propped myself up on the pillows, and opened my book. I must have been more tired than I realized, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up with the book still open on my chest and the bedside lamp still on. Something had woken me, a sound from outside. I lay perfectly still, listening. There it was again, a scratching or shuffling noise near the cabin. Probably just a raccoon or something, I told myself, but I couldn't shake the uneasiness I felt. I got up, moving quietly to the window. Pulling the curtain back just an inch, I peered out into the darkness. The moon had risen, casting a pale light over the yard, but I couldn't see anything unusual. I was about to go back to bed when a shadow moved at the edge of the trees, something large. My heart started hammering in my chest. It was probably just a deer, I reasoned, but it didn't move like a deer. It seemed to be standing upright. A bear, then? I'd heard bears sometimes stood on their hind legs, but even as I tried to convince myself it was normal wildlife, I knew whatever I was looking at was too tall, too human-like. I let the curtain fall back into place, suddenly feeling exposed standing by the window. I wasn't going to get back to sleep now, that was certain. I went to the living room, turned on all the lights, and sat in a chair facing the front door, listening to every creak and rustle from outside. The rest of the night passed without incident, though I dozed rather than truly slept. As first light began to filter through the windows, I felt foolish for being so spooked. This was a wilderness area. Of course, there were animals moving around at night. I showered, dressed, and decided to walk down to Will's place a bit earlier than planned. The morning was beautiful, cool and misty, with birds singing in the trees. In the daylight, my fears from the night before seemed ridiculous. As I started down the driveway, I noticed something odd. Several rocks scattered across the gravel, rocks that hadn't been there when I arrived yesterday. They looked out of place, rounder and darker than the local stone, almost like river rocks. I didn't think much of it at the time, just kicked one aside and continued walking. I spent a pleasant day with Will, fishing at a lake about 20 minutes from his house. We caught several good-sized trout, and my tension melted away under the warm sun. Will was good company, telling stories about local characters and his life since moving to Seashell. I almost mentioned what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, the night before, but decided against it. No sense sounding like a nervous city boy. We headed back in the late afternoon with our fish. Mary cooked them up for an early dinner, and it was one of the best meals I'd had in years. The time slipped away with good food and conversation, and before I knew it, the sun was getting low again. "I'd better get back to the cabin," I said, standing up from their kitchen table. "Thanks for everything." Will frowned slightly. "You want me to drive you up?" "It'll be dark soon." "No need," I said, patting the flashlight he'd lent me that morning. "It's not far, and it's a nice evening for a walk." Will still looked concerned but didn't push it. He walked me out to the road and pointed up toward the cabin's driveway. "Remember what I said about strange noises. Just stay inside if you hear anything unusual." I promised I would, wondering again what he wasn't telling me. The walk back was pleasant, with the sunset painting the sky in spectacular oranges and pinks. I reached the bottom of the cabin's driveway just as dusk was settling in. The woods were getting dark, but I could still see well enough without the flashlight. I was about halfway up the driveway when I heard it, a heavy rustling in the underbrush on the bank to my right, about 15 feet above the drive. I stopped, peering up into the gathering darkness. The rustling stopped too. "Hello," I called, thinking it might be Will checking up on me, though that didn't make much sense. No answer, but the rustling started again, more deliberate now. Then I saw it, a massive dark shape moving between the trees on the bank. It was huge, far bigger than a man, and covered in what looked like dark fur. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't move like that. This thing was standing upright, its outline unmistakably humanoid despite its enormous size. I stood frozen, unable to believe what I was seeing. The shape moved forward a bit, still partially obscured by trees, but close enough now that I could make out broad shoulders, long arms, and a large, somewhat pointed head. It must have been at least 7 or 8 feet tall. Then something hit the ground near my feet with a sharp crack. A rock. Another followed, landing closer, then a third that actually struck my shoulder, hard enough to hurt. The thing on the bank was throwing rocks at me. That broke my paralysis. I turned and ran back down the driveway as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I could hear more rocks hitting the ground behind me as I ran, and what might have been heavy footsteps moving parallel to me up on the bank. The sounds followed me all the way to the main road, where they suddenly stopped. I stood there at the bottom of the drive, gasping for breath, my heart feeling like it might burst from my chest. I was too afraid to go back up to the cabin, but also afraid to stay where I was. What if that thing came down to the road? I started walking quickly toward Will's house, constantly looking over my shoulder. After about 5 minutes, I saw headlights approaching and frantically waved my arms. The car slowed. It was a local man named Peterson, whom I'd met briefly at Will's place. He stopped, rolled down his window and asked if I was okay. I must have looked a fright, standing there shaking in the gathering darkness. I managed to ask him for a ride to Will's house, saying only that I'd seen something in the woods that scared me. He seemed to understand more than I was saying, giving me a knowing look as I climbed into his truck. When we got to Will's place, I was still so shaken that I could barely get the story out. Will sat me down, poured me a whiskey, and listened without interrupting. When I finished, he exchanged a look with Mary that I couldn't interpret. "You believe me, don't you?" I asked, suddenly uncertain. It all seemed so impossible now that I was sitting in their warm, bright kitchen. Will nodded slowly. "I believe you, Ed, and there's something I should have told you yesterday." He took a deep breath. "About 2 weeks ago, me and 2 other fellows had a similar experience at the Miller cabin about 3 miles from here. We were fixing a leaky roof when one of these creatures showed up in the doorway, just standing there watching us. Must have been 8 feet tall. We all saw it clear as day before it turned and disappeared into the trees." I stared at him, not sure whether to be relieved that he believed me or angry that he hadn't warned me. "That's why I was worried about you staying up there alone," he continued. "I should have said something, but I didn't want to scare you off. Most people around here know not to go wandering the back roads alone at dusk. That's when they seem to be active." "They," I repeated. "There's more than one of these things?" "Nobody knows for sure," Will said. "But there have been stories around these parts for years. The locals call them Sasquatch. The Indians have different names for them. Most times they keep to themselves deep in the woods. But lately—" He trailed off, looking troubled. "Lately what?" I demanded. "Lately they've been coming closer to where people live. Some folks think it's the heat. This summer's been unusually hot and dry, might be affecting their normal patterns. Others think there's logging too close to their territory, pushing them into new areas." I took a large swallow of whiskey. "What exactly are these things, Will?" He shrugged. "Nobody really knows. Some kind of animal that hasn't been discovered by science yet, I guess. The old-timers say they've always been here." "I'm not staying in that cabin tonight," I said firmly. "Course not," Will replied. "You'll stay here. Tomorrow we'll go up with Constable Mitchell and check things out in daylight." I slept poorly on Will's sofa, jumping at every noise outside. The next morning, after a silent breakfast, Will called the local constable, a stocky, middle-aged man named Robert Mitchell, who took my story with surprising seriousness. The 3 of us drove up to the cabin around 9. In the bright morning light, everything looked normal, peaceful even. My suitcase and belongings were still inside, undisturbed. We walked the property thoroughly, finding nothing unusual until we reached the section of the driveway where I'd been the night before. There, scattered across the gravel, were at least a dozen rocks that didn't belong. Smooth, dark stones that Mitchell said looked like they came from the creek several hundred yards away. And on the bank above, where I'd seen the creature standing, we found what I'd been both hoping and dreading to find. Footprints, 3 clear impressions in a patch of mud, each over 15 inches long and shaped like an enormous bare human foot. Mitchell took measurements and made sketches in his notebook. Will stood staring at the prints, his face pale. I just felt sick, the reality of what had happened hitting me all over again. "You're lucky," Mitchell said finally, closing his notebook. "Usually they avoid people completely. I've never heard of one throwing rocks before. That's new. Might have been trying to scare you away from its territory." It worked, I thought, but didn't say. I collected my things from the cabin and stayed at Will's house for the remainder of my vacation, never going back up that driveway. We still went fishing, but always with at least 3 of us together, and we were always back before dusk. The incident became known locally as the Pennsylvania Tourist Incident. That's me, and I heard it added to the local lore about these creatures. People in town treated me with a kind of respectful curiosity when they learned who I was, many sharing their own stories of strange sightings or unexplained noises in the woods. That was over 60 years ago now. I've never gone back to Seashell, though Will and I corresponded until his death in 1978. I've read about Bigfoot sightings over the years, seen the blurry photos and heard the supposed recordings of their calls. Some seem credible, others obviously fake. But I know what I saw that August evening in 1956, and I know what I found the next morning. Whatever was on that bank wasn't human, but it wasn't just an animal either. It was something in between, something that doesn't fit neatly into our understanding of the world. And sometimes, on dark nights when the wind moves through the trees outside my window, I still hear the sound of rocks hitting the ground behind me. Story 9. I still don't sleep right most nights. It's been nearly 16 years since that day in August of '56, but I can still see those eyes looking at me, sizing me up like I was the strange one in that forest. I've never shared this story outside of the official report and conversations with Sam and Jake. They've both moved on from Bella Coola, Sam to Vancouver and Jake down to Seattle. Me, I couldn't leave. Something about that encounter keeps me here, like I'm waiting for confirmation that I wasn't going crazy that day. I was 32 back then, had been hunting in those woods since I was old enough to hold my daddy's .30-06. There isn't an animal in these parts I haven't tracked, skinned, or at least spotted. Black bears, grizzlies, mountain lions, wolverines, I know them all by sight, by sound, by the way they move through the underbrush. What we saw that day wasn't any of those, not by a long shot. It was August 14th, 1956. The weather had been unseasonably warm that summer, and the three of us, me, Samuel Peterson, and Jacob Reynolds, had decided to take a drive up to scout some locations for the fall hunting season. We'd packed some sandwiches, a thermos of coffee, and my old map of the area, with markers from previous successful hunts. Jake had bought a new Kodak camera he was eager to try out on wildlife. We set out in my '49 Ford pickup around 5:30 that morning. The sun was just starting to crawl over the mountain range to the east, and the air had that special kind of crispness you only get in the early hours before the heat takes over. The road was rough as hell, not much more than a logging trail in some parts, winding its way through thick stands of cedar and Douglas fir. The forest was dense on either side, occasionally breaking to reveal steep drops down to rocky creek beds. Sam was riding shotgun, half asleep against the window, and Jake was in the middle, fiddling with his camera. I remember Jake saying something about how the light was going to be good for photography that day. Seemed so normal, so ordinary in my memory compared to what came later. We'd been driving for maybe 2 hours, having gone about 40 miles inland from Bella Coola. We were on a particularly remote stretch where the road straightened out for about a quarter mile before disappearing around a bend. That's when Sam suddenly sat up straight and pointed ahead. "Hold up, Mark! Slow down!" he said, leaning forward over the dashboard. I eased off the gas. At first, I thought maybe he'd spotted a deer or even a bear, which wouldn't have been unusual, but then I saw it too, and my hands tightened on the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. About 50 yards ahead, on the right side of the road, where a patch of blueberry bushes grew thick and wild, was something I'd never seen before. From a distance, I initially thought it might be a bear standing on its hind legs. But bears, even when they're upright, have a certain awkwardness to them. This thing was different. It moved with purpose, with precision. I killed the engine without even thinking about it. The sudden silence was thick with tension. "What the hell is that?" Jake whispered, grabbing his camera from his lap. None of us answered. We were all just staring. The creature was tall, I'd estimate around 7 feet, and covered in dark brown hair that had a strange reddish tint where the morning sunlight hit it. It wasn't shaggy like a bear's fur, but smoother, more uniform. And it was standing fully upright, not hunched over like you'd expect from an animal, but it was the way it was gathering berries that really got to me. Its hands, and they were hands, not paws, moved with careful precision, plucking the berries and bringing them to its mouth in a motion that was disturbingly human-like. Its fingers were long, with what looked like opposable thumbs. I remember thinking no animal should be able to do that, to manipulate things with that kind of dexterity. Is that... Sam started to say, but he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. We all knew the stories the local Nuxalk people told about the Box, the wild men of the woods. I'd always written them off as tall tales, the kind of thing you tell around a campfire to scare your friends. But sitting there in my truck, watching this creature methodically gather and eat berries, I wasn't so sure anymore. For what felt like forever, but was probably only about 5 minutes, we just sat there watching it. None of us made a move to grab our rifles from the back. It didn't feel like a hunting situation. It felt like we were witnessing something, sacred isn't the right word, but something rare and significant. Then Jake, moving slowly like he was afraid the slightest noise would shatter the moment, raised his camera. The click of the shutter seemed impossibly loud in the quiet morning air. That's when it happened. The creature stopped mid-motion, a handful of berries halfway to its mouth. Slowly, it turned its head toward us. I swear to God, the look on its face is burned into my memory forever. Its features were almost human-like, but with a pronounced protruding mouth and a heavy brow. But it was the eyes that got me. Dark, intelligent, and unmistakably aware. Not the dead, instinctual eyes of an animal, but something that held knowledge, maybe even wisdom. It straightened up to its full height then, still staring right at us. The hair on my arms stood up, and a cold sweat broke out across my back. It wasn't fear exactly, though there was plenty of that too. It was the sudden, overwhelming certainty that I was being seen and recognized as another thinking being. We locked eyes for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then, without any warning or sound, it turned and walked, not ran, not lumbered, but walked into the forest. Its gait was smooth and upright, bipedal like a human, but with a strange fluidity that no person I've ever seen could match. It moved between the trees with perfect confidence, never breaking stride or looking back, until the thick forest swallowed it completely. The three of us sat in stunned silence for a long time afterward. I remember my hands were shaking when I finally turned the key to restart the truck. "Did you get a picture?" I asked Jake, my voice coming out rougher than I expected. He nodded, still staring at the spot where the creature had disappeared. "I think so. Won't know until I develop it." "That wasn't a bear," Sam said firmly. "Not a person in a suit either." "No," I agreed, "it wasn't." We drove on after that, but our hearts weren't in the hunting trip anymore. We kept looking into the trees, scanning the underbrush. The forest that had always been my second home suddenly felt alien and mysterious. We turned back earlier than planned, making it home before dark. That evening, the three of us sat on my porch, drinking whiskey straight from the bottle and talking in low voices about what we'd seen. Jake had written detailed notes about the encounter while it was still fresh in his mind. The estimated height, the coloration, the movements. Sam kept saying he'd heard stories from his grandfather about similar sightings from the early 1900s, further north near Hakai Pass. I remember Jake saying, "We should report this. There are people who study this kind of thing." Sam and I were hesitant at first. In a small community like Bella Coola, you don't want to be known as the crazy person who sees monsters in the woods. But Jake was insistent. He'd read about researchers from universities who collected these kinds of accounts, and he thought our sighting was significant because all three of us had seen it clearly in broad daylight. So we did report it, eventually. A researcher from the University of British Columbia came down to interview us, record our statements. He brought a Nuxalk elder with him who listened to our story without surprise, nodding occasionally like we were simply confirming something he'd always known. The elder told us that the Box had been known to his people for countless generations. "They are the old ones," he said. "They were here before us, and they'll be here after. They know the deep places in the mountains where humans don't go." When Jake's photographs were developed, they were disappointingly blurry, just a dark, upright shape against the green of the forest. Not enough to convince a skeptic, but more than enough to haunt my dreams. In the years since, I've gone back to that stretch of highway dozens of times. I tell myself I'm just hunting, just scouting, but I know what I'm really looking for. I've never seen the creature again, though sometimes when I'm deep in the forest, I get the prickling sensation of being watched. The feeling isn't threatening, just attentive. I've researched everything I could find about similar sightings. The newspapers occasionally run stories about Sasquatch encounters, some of them not far from where we had our experience. Most people treat these stories as jokes or hoaxes, and maybe some of them are. But I know what I saw. There was an odd postscript to our encounter that I've never been able to explain. About a month after the sighting, I was hunting alone near the same area. I'd shot a deer late in the afternoon and was field dressing it as the sun began to set. I had the uncomfortable feeling of being watched the entire time, but I chalked it up to nerves and the lingering impact of our sighting. As darkness fell and I prepared to drag the deer back to my truck, I noticed something strange. A neat pile of blueberries placed on a large leaf about 10 feet from where I was working. They hadn't been there when I started, I'm certain of it. They were arranged too perfectly to be natural, about 20 berries in a deliberate little mound. The forest was completely silent. No bird calls, no insect sounds, just the soft rustle of wind through the trees. I left the berries untouched and hurried back to my vehicle with my deer, feeling unsettled in a way I can't quite describe. Was it the same creature leaving me some kind of offering? A trade? An acknowledgement? I'll never know. But sometimes I think about those intelligent eyes, that careful, deliberate gathering of berries, and I wonder just how much these beings understand about us, about our world that overlaps with theirs. I still hunt these woods. I still love this land. But I move through it differently now, with the awareness that I'm not at the top of the chain out here, or at least not alone at the top. There's something else in these mountains that watches and thinks and knows. And sometimes, in the deepest part of night when sleep won't come, I find myself wondering which one of us was really being observed that day. Were we the discoverers, or were we the discovered? Story 10. I've been sitting on this for way too long, 66 years to be exact. I don't know how much longer I'll be around. I'm 87 now, and I can't take this to my grave. What happened in East Sook back in '57 has haunted me ever since, and I need to tell someone who might actually believe me. My name is Michael Henderson. I was 21 then, working as a junior reporter for the Vancouver Island Gazette. Not exactly the New York Times, but it was a good job for a young guy with an English degree and a knack for writing. I mostly covered local events, fishing tournaments, council meetings, that sort of thing. But I had this fascination with the island's folklore, especially the stories from the First Nations communities. My editor, Bill Armstrong, knew about my interest and would occasionally throw me a bone, no pun intended as you'll see, by letting me write feature pieces about local legends. In early October 1957, he handed me a tip about a First Nations family in East Sook who claimed to have found something unusual. "Probably nothing, Henderson," he said, "but go check it out. At worst, it's a slow newsday filler." I drove out to East Sook the next morning. It was one of those perfect Pacific Northwest autumn days. Crisp air, low fog hugging the coastline, the smell of salt water and pine. I remember thinking how peaceful it was as I navigated the winding roads through the dense forest. I had no idea what was waiting for me. I pulled up to the address I'd been given, a modest home on a large piece of property near the water. The man who answered the door introduced himself as Thomas Cloudwalker, mid-50s, weathered face, kind eyes. He invited me in without hesitation, like he'd been expecting me. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Henderson," he said, offering me coffee. "What I'm about to show you is very important to my family, very sacred. but we think it's time others knew about it." I nodded, notebook ready, trying to look professional despite my youth and inexperience. I'd done these kinds of interviews before, local folklore, family heirlooms with supposed magical properties, that sort of thing. I figured this would be more of the same. I was wrong. So wrong. Thomas led me to a shed behind the house. It was well built, padlocked, with small windows covered by heavy curtains. He unlocked it carefully, glancing around as if to make sure we weren't being watched. Inside, the space was surprisingly clean and organized. Tools hanging on walls, workbenches, shelves of supplies, but Thomas headed straight for a large wooden chest in the corner. 3 years ago, he began. My cousin Daniel was operating a bulldozer for a construction company. They were clearing land for a new building about 5 miles from here. Daniel noticed something unusual in the dirt, something that didn't look like a root or a rock. Thomas knelt by the chest, unlocking it with a key he kept on a leather cord around his neck. Daniel stopped working and investigated. What he found shocked him so badly he didn't tell anyone except family for weeks. The chest creaked open. Thomas reached in and carefully removed something wrapped in what looked like ceremonial blankets. He placed it on a workbench and slowly unwrapped it. I remember my heart racing, expecting maybe an arrowhead collection or an old mask. But as the last layer came off, I physically stepped back. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was a bone. But not just any bone. It was easily 4 feet long, shaped unmistakably like a human lower leg and foot, the tibia, I believe, but of impossible proportions. The foot part alone was nearly 20 inches in length. The bone was obviously old, a deep yellowish-brown color, but remarkably preserved. What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "This," Thomas said solemnly, "is proof that the Sasquatch stories my grandfather told me are not just stories." I reached out, then hesitated. Thomas nodded, giving me permission to touch it. The bone was heavy, solid, with the texture and weight you'd expect from real bone. This wasn't plaster or wood or any fake material I could identify. It felt ancient and somehow powerful. "May I measure it?" I asked, pulling out my tape measure. I'd learned early in my reporting career to always carry one. Thomas nodded. The bone was 49 inches from end to end. The foot portion was 19.5 inches long and 8 inches across at its widest point. I took detailed notes, aware that my hand was shaking. "Based on the proportions," Thomas explained, "if this was from a creature built like a human, it would have stood at least 15 feet tall." I remember feeling dizzy. I'd heard Sasquatch stories my whole life. Who hadn't, growing up in the Pacific Northwest? But they were always about 8-9-foot creatures, not something of this magnitude. "Our people have stories going back many generations," Thomas continued. "Stories of the tall ones who lived in the deep forests. Most white people think these are just myths, fairy tales. But my grandfather saw one when he was a young man. My great-uncle tracked one for 3 days in 1913. They are real, Mr. Henderson." I asked the obvious question. "Has this been examined by scientists?" Thomas's expression darkened. "We showed it to a professor from Victoria College last year. He wanted to take it away for testing, said it was probably from a prehistoric mammal, and wanted to date it. But this is sacred to us. It doesn't belong in a laboratory or a museum. It belongs with the people who understand what it is." I took several photographs with my Kodak. Thomas helped me position the bone next to everyday objects for scale. A coffee mug, a hunting knife, his own forearm. The comparative size was staggering. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked as I finished my roll of film. Thomas was quiet for a moment, staring at the bone. "My family has discussed this for months. The old ways say we should protect this knowledge, keep it sacred, but the world is changing. The forests where these beings live are shrinking. More people need to understand that they're real, that they need protection too." He looked up at me, his eyes intense. "We want you to write about this. Show people the pictures. We're even willing to display it, temporarily, somewhere public. The Empress Hotel in Victoria, perhaps, somewhere respectful. People need to know the truth." I promised to write the article, to be accurate and respectful. I spent another hour with Thomas, learning about his family's encounters with Sasquatch over generations. He shared stories that made my skin crawl, not because they depicted the creatures as monsters, but because they painted a picture of intelligent beings who had deliberately remained hidden from human civilization. I drove back to the newspaper office in a daze. My editor was skeptical when I told him what I'd seen, but the photographs were compelling. We published a front-page article 3 days later, complete with the measurements and several of the photographs. We titled it, "East Suk Discovery Challenges Science, Ancient Giants Remains Found." The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Our small newspaper office was flooded with calls. Local radio stations picked up the story. Within days, researchers from several universities were trying to contact Thomas Cloudwalker. I went back to East Suk a week after the article published. I found Thomas agitated, nervous. "People won't leave us alone," he said. "Scientists, reporters, even government people, they all want the bone. Some don't even ask. They demand it like they have a right to it." I apologized, feeling responsible. He waved it off. "It's not your fault. We knew this would happen. We just didn't expect so much disrespect." He invited me in for coffee, but declined to show me the bone again. "It's safer if fewer people know exactly where it is now," he explained. 2 weeks later, Thomas called me at the newspaper office. His voice was tight with anger and grief. "It's gone," he said simply. I drove out to East Suk immediately. The shed had been broken into, the chest forced open, the bone was missing. Thomas was beside himself. "Who would do this?" I asked, though I had my suspicions. "Could be anyone," he said bitterly. "Those university people who kept calling, the government men in suits, could even be someone who wants to sell it." He shook his head. "But they don't understand what they've taken. It's not just a specimen. It's part of the history of this land." We filed a police report, but it went nowhere. The investigating officer barely hid his skepticism about what had been stolen. "A giant bone, huh?" he said, smirking as he took notes. The story of the theft made the paper, but smaller this time, on page 3. Public interest had already begun to wane. Within a month, people were dismissing the whole thing as a hoax or a misidentified elephant bone or some other explanation. But I knew what I had seen. I had held that bone in my hands. I had measured it myself, and nothing in my education or experience could explain it adequately. For months afterward, I followed up on rumors. Some said researchers from the University of British Columbia had the bone. Others claimed it had been shipped to the Smithsonian. One particularly persistent rumor suggested that men from a U.S. military research facility had confiscated it. But every lead went cold. About a year later, I ran into Daniel Thundercloud, Thomas's cousin, who had originally found the bone. He was leaving a local bar as I was entering. He recognized me immediately and pulled me aside. "The family has it back," he whispered, the smell of whiskey heavy on his breath. "Thomas's older brother and some cousins tracked it down. Took it back in the night from some professor's office in Victoria. It's hidden now, really hidden. No white man will ever see it again." I never confirmed if this was true. Thomas Cloudwalker moved away from East Suk shortly after the theft. I tried to find him a few times over the years, but never succeeded. Daniel died in a fishing accident in 1962, taking whatever he knew to his grave. I left the newspaper business in 1965, moved to Edmonton for a job in publishing, but I never forgot what I saw in that shed. I've spent decades researching similar finds, collecting Sasquatch accounts, trying to make sense of it all. Here's what haunts me the most. In all my research, I've never found another report of Sasquatch remains of that size, 8 to 9 feet tall, yes, but 15 feet. Nothing. It's as if what Thomas showed me was unique, evidence of something beyond even the legends most people know. I keep coming back to something Thomas told me that first day. He said his grandfather believed there were different kinds of these beings. Some more human-like, some more ancient, more primitive and larger, some that even the other Sasquatch feared. Was that what the bone came from? Not just a Sasquatch, but something else entirely? I still have the photographs I took that day, yellowed now, but clear enough. I've shown them to experts over the years, anthropologists, paleontologists. Their reactions are always mixed. Some dismiss them immediately, others become quiet, troubled. One professor at the University of Alberta studied them for an hour in silence before handing them back with shaking hands. "I can't explain this," was all he said. "I'm an old man now. I've had a good life, a career I'm proud of. But this unresolved mystery has followed me for 66 years. What was that bone? Where is it now? And most importantly, what else is out there in the deep forests of Vancouver Island that we haven't discovered yet? I still dream about it sometimes. In my dreams, I'm back in that shed. But instead of just the bone, the entire skeleton is assembled. 15 feet tall, watching me with empty eye sockets. And somehow, even in death, it feels alive, ancient and aware. I don't know how much longer I'll be around to wonder about these things, but maybe someone reading this has answers. Maybe someone knows where that bone ended up. Or maybe someone else has seen something similar and has been afraid to come forward. All I know is what I saw with my own eyes in East Souk in 1957. And it changed everything I thought I understood about the world we live in. Story 11. I've been holding this inside for so long that it feels strange to finally type it out. Even now, my hands are shaking as I write this. I guess I should start by saying I'm from the Songhees tribe on Vancouver Island. Back in 1957, I was a young man in my 20s, confident and fearless like most men that age. I hunted these woods my whole life, knew every trail and creek around East Souk like the back of my hand. But what happened at Matheson Lake changed everything for me, changed who I am. That morning started like any other hunting day. The air was crisp, with that smell of cedar and wet earth that fills our forests here. I remember it was early October, and there was just the slightest bite of the coming winter in the air. I'd gotten up before dawn, packed my truck with supplies, and headed out while the stars were still visible. I parked at the old logging access road about half a mile from Matheson Lake, planning to work my way through the eastern ridge, where deer were plentiful. My uncle had warned me the night before not to go hunting alone near Matheson. He was one of our tribal elders, and like many of them, he believed the area was sacred ground, protected by what our people called timber giants. Odim. I'd heard these stories my whole life. Warnings about massive beings that guarded the ancient forests, creatures that could uproot trees and crush stones. But like most young men, I brushed off these warnings as old superstitions. We needed meat for the coming winter, and the eastern ridge had always been good hunting. The morning passed uneventfully. I tracked a small buck for about an hour, but lost him in a dense thicket. By midday, I'd worked my way deeper into the forest than I'd initially planned, reaching the northern edge of Matheson Lake. The trees there were old growth, massive cedars and Douglas firs that had stood for centuries. Something about the way the light filtered through them made the place feel different, quieter, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I decided to rest and eat the sandwich I'd packed. The lake was beautiful that day, still as glass, reflecting the surrounding trees like a perfect mirror. As I sat there, I noticed something strange. There were no birds calling. Usually these woods were full of sound, woodpeckers, jays, chickadees, but there was nothing, just this heavy silence that seemed to press down on everything. I remember feeling suddenly uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. After finishing my lunch, I decided to circle back toward my truck, using a different route, one that would take me along the western shore of the lake and then through a stand of particularly ancient cedars. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when I first sensed something was wrong. It's hard to explain, but hunters develop a kind of sixth sense in the woods. You can feel when you're being watched. At first, I tried to tell myself it was just a cougar or maybe a black bear. We have plenty of both on the island. I gripped my rifle tighter and continued walking, but more cautiously now. The forest had gone completely silent, not even the sound of wind in the trees, just my own footsteps and breathing. Then I heard it. A sound I still hear in my nightmares. It wasn't a roar like a bear's or a scream like a cougar's. It was something altogether different, deeper, more powerful. It started low, almost like the rumble before an earthquake, then built into this ear-splitting sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The ground actually vibrated beneath my feet. My whole body froze. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't even breathe for what felt like forever. When I finally managed to turn toward the source of the sound, I saw it. Behind a stand of massive cedars, maybe 50 yards away, something was moving. At first, my mind couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was too big, too impossible. But as it stepped fully into view, I felt a kind of terror I've never experienced before or since. It was a being, standing upright like a man, but there was nothing human about it. The creature was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair from head to toe, with a face that was somewhere between human and ape, but neither exactly. Its eyes were deep-set and dark, intelligent in a way that made my blood run cold. But what I remember most clearly was its size. I'm not exaggerating when I say this thing was around 18 feet tall. Its head was well above the lower branches of the surrounding trees. Its shoulders were broader than my truck. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't think. Then some survival instinct kicked in, and I turned and ran. I didn't even think about shooting. My rifle suddenly felt as useless as a toy in my hands. I just ran, faster than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through underbrush, stumbling over roots and rocks. Behind me, I heard a sound like thunder. The creature was pursuing me. The ground shook with each of its strides. Then came a cracking, tearing noise that I couldn't identify at first. When I glanced back over my shoulder, what I saw nearly stopped my heart. The thing was ripping entire trees out of the ground, trees that had stood for hundreds of years, and throwing them at me like they were twigs. I remember seeing a massive cedar, roots and all, sailing through the air above me. It crashed down maybe 20 feet to my right, sending dirt and debris flying. Some of it hit me in the face, temporarily blinding me, but I didn't stop running. I couldn't. The main trail back to my truck seemed impossibly far away. My lungs were burning. My legs felt like lead. But the sound of that thing behind me, the roaring, the crashing, the tearing of wood and earth kept me moving. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to stretch and distort. But finally, I broke through the tree line and saw my truck parked where I'd left it on the logging road. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly get the key in the ignition. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see that massive figure emerge from the trees. When the engine finally started, I floored it, the tires spinning in the gravel before finding purchase. I drove like a madman all the way home, constantly checking the mirror, sure that at any moment I'd see the creature coming after me. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not at first. Who would believe me? I made up a story about feeling sick and coming home early, but I couldn't sleep for weeks afterward. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing. Its massive form, those intelligent eyes, the way it tore trees from the earth like they were nothing. For years, I refused to go into the woods alone. When I did hunt, I stayed close to town, close to others. Some of my friends noticed the change in me, but I brushed it off, said I was just getting older, more cautious. The truth was, I was terrified. Not just of encountering that creature again, but of having to face the reality that everything I thought I knew about the world was wrong. It wasn't until 1972, 15 years after it happened, that I finally told my story. A reporter named Catherine Williams was doing a piece on local legends and somehow heard rumors that I'd had an encounter with something in the woods. She tracked me down, and for reasons I still don't fully understand, I agreed to talk to her. Telling the story again after all those years brought everything back. The terror, the disbelief, the way my whole world view had been shattered in a single afternoon. Williams must have seen how affected I still was. She suggested we visit the site together, and though every instinct screamed against it, I agreed. Going back to Matheson Lake was one of the hardest things I've ever done. As we approached the area where I'd encountered the creature, I felt physically ill. But what we found there convinced me once and for all that I hadn't imagined or exaggerated what happened. In the stand of ancient cedars where I'd first seen the being, several massive trees had been uprooted with tremendous force. Their root systems were exposed, the surrounding earth still disturbed even after 15 years. These weren't trees that had fallen naturally in a storm. They had been pulled up and tossed aside by something inconceivably strong. Williams took photos and measurements. She spoke with several tribal elders who confirmed that our people had always known Matheson Lake was a special, dangerous place. They shared stories passed down through generations about the timber giants who protected the old forests, beings that demanded respect and caution from humans who entered their domain. That was over 30 years ago now. I'm an old man, and I've never again encountered anything like what I saw that day at Matheson Lake. But I've never forgotten it either. I still dream about it sometimes. That roar that seemed to shake the very air. Those eyes that held an intelligence as old as the forest itself. The impossible strength that could tear ancient trees from the earth. I don't go to Matheson Lake anymore, I can't. But sometimes I wonder if it's still there, watching and waiting in those ancient woods. Protecting a place that was sacred long before any of us were here, and will remain so long after we're gone. I don't expect everyone to believe my story. I wouldn't if I hadn't lived it. But I know what I saw that day in 1957, and no matter how much time passes, no matter how old I get, I'll never forget the timber giant of Matheson Lake, or the day it showed me that the world is far stranger and more terrifying than most of us ever realize. Story 12. I still don't know what I saw that day in '58. Even now, my hands get clammy thinking about it. It's been 65 years, and I've never spoken publicly about what happened near New Hazelton. But I'm not getting any younger, and maybe it's time someone else knew. My name is Rose Hibbant. I was 27 that summer, teaching at the elementary school in New Hazelton, British Columbia. I had moved there 3 years prior after finishing college. It was a quiet town surrounded by some of the most beautiful wilderness I'd ever seen. Dense forests of pine and spruce, mountains that seemed to touch the clouds, and wildlife everywhere. My friend Margaret Thompson had lived there her whole life. She was about 10 years older than me and worked as a wildlife guide, taking tourists and hunters through the backcountry. There wasn't much Margaret didn't know about the animals and terrain around New Hazelton. She could track a deer for miles, identify every bird call, and knew exactly which berries were safe to eat and which would have you doubled over with stomach cramps. It was early August 1958, one of those perfect summer days, clear blue sky, temperature in the mid-70s, not a cloud in sight. School was out for summer, and I had nothing but time on my hands. Margaret had the day off, so we decided to take a drive out to Seeley Lake. Margaret had her father's old Chevrolet pickup, a faded blue thing that rattled and groaned, but somehow kept running. We packed a small picnic, some sandwiches, a thermos of coffee, and Margaret's famous blueberry muffins. I remember being excited about having a day away from town, just enjoying the wilderness. We left around 10 in the morning, windows down, feeling the warm summer air rush through the cab of the truck. The road to Seeley Lake wasn't much more than a wide dirt path that wound through the forest. It was rarely travelled except by locals and the occasional logging truck. About 7 miles outside of town, the road straightened out for about half a mile before curving around a large outcropping of rock. This straight section ran parallel to a meadow on one side and dense forest on the other. We were chatting about nothing important, local gossip, plans for the rest of summer, a book I'd been reading. Margaret was driving, one hand on the wheel, the other gesturing as she talked. I was looking out the passenger window, half listening, just taking in the scenery. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a bear. We had black bears and the occasional grizzly in the area, so seeing one wasn't unusual. But something felt off immediately. It was standing at the edge of the forest, perfectly still, just watching the road, completely upright on 2 legs. "Margaret," I said, my voice catching, "stop the truck." She must have heard something in my tone because she didn't question me, just eased off the gas and pulled over to the side of the road. The truck idled roughly as we both stared out my window. "Do you see that?" I whispered, though there was no way whatever it was could hear me from inside the vehicle. "I see it," Margaret replied, her voice unnaturally flat. "That's not a bear." Now, I need to explain something here. I've always had exceptional eyesight. As a teacher, I could read what students were writing from across the classroom. I could spot a hawk circling high above when others couldn't see anything. And what I was looking at definitely wasn't a bear. It was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen. If I had to guess, I'd say around 7 feet, maybe more. It was covered head to toe in thick reddish-brown hair or fur. Not patchy like a mangy bear, but uniform. Its arms were impossibly long, hanging down past its knees. The shoulders were broad and powerful-looking, tapering to a narrower waist. But it was the face that made my blood run cold. From where we sat, maybe 50 yards away, I could make out a sloped forehead, almost like it receded back from prominent brow ridges. The eyes were deep-set, dark shadows in that strange face. I couldn't make out a nose or mouth clearly through the hair, but the face seemed flatter, more human-like than a bear's protruding snout. Margaret killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. We sat there, neither of us speaking, barely breathing, just watching this thing as it stood motionless at the tree line. "What is it?" I finally whispered. Margaret shook her head slowly. "In all my years guiding in these woods, I've never seen anything like it. It's not a bear, it's not a moose, it's not anything I recognize." Coming from Margaret, that statement hit me hard. She knew every creature in these forests. The thing hadn't moved since we stopped. It just stood there, watching us as intently as we were watching it. There was an intelligence in that gaze that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't the mindless stare of a curious deer or the predatory focus of a cougar. It was aware, evaluating us. I don't know how long we sat there staring at each other, probably less than a minute, but it felt like hours. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure Margaret could hear it. My mouth had gone completely dry. Then, without warning, it moved. Not in a rush or panic, but deliberately. It simply turned. A smooth, fluid motion that no bear could manage on its hind legs, and walked into the forest. Not crashing through the underbrush like a startled animal, but with purpose. With a gait that was unnervingly human-like, yet not quite right. The way it moved reminded me of someone walking through deep water, a smooth, rolling motion. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the dense trees. We sat in silence for at least another minute. I realized I'd been holding my breath and let it out in a shaky exhale. "Did you—" I started, then had to swallow hard before continuing. "Did you see that?" Margaret nodded, her knuckles white where she gripped the steering wheel. "I saw it." "What was it?" I asked again, my voice barely audible. Margaret turned to look at me, her face pale. "People around here, The old-timers and the native folks. They talk about something in these woods, something that's not supposed to exist." She paused. "They call it different names, but most people know it as Sasquatch." I'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the Pacific Northwest had. But they were just that. Stories. Campfire tales to scare children, not something you actually saw standing in broad daylight by the side of a road. That's not possible," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew what I'd seen wasn't any known animal. "Rose," Margaret said firmly, "I've tracked every animal in these mountains since I was a girl. I've seen bears stand on their hind legs. I've seen moose and elk from every angle. I've even seen a man in a hunting outfit from a distance." She shook her head. "That wasn't any of those things." My skin prickled with goose flesh despite the warm air. Should we go look? Maybe find tracks or something?" The look Margaret gave me made me instantly regret suggesting it. "No," she said flatly. "We're not going into those trees. Not today." She started the truck again, the engine's rumble breaking the eerie silence that had fallen over us. Instead of continuing to the lake, Margaret turned the truck around, heading back toward town. "We need to tell someone," I said as we drove. "The ranger station, maybe." Margaret nodded slowly. "Doug Mackenzie's on duty today. If anyone would take this seriously, it's him." The Forest Ranger Station was a small wooden building on the edge of town. Doug Mackenzie was in his 50s, with weathered skin and grey-streaked hair that spoke of decades spent outdoors. He'd been the ranger in New Hazelton for nearly 20 years. When we walked in, Doug was at his desk, reading through some paperwork. He looked up, surprised to see us. "Margaret Rose," he greeted us with a nod. "What brings you ladies in today? Thought you were headed out to the lake." Margaret didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We saw something on the North Road, Doug, about 7 miles out, near Fletcher's Meadow." Something in her tone made Doug set down his papers and give us his full attention. "What kind of something?" I let Margaret do the talking. She described what we'd seen in precise detail, the height, the coloring, the way it moved. Doug's expression remained neutral, but I noticed his eyes sharpen with interest. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Funny you should mention this today," he said slowly. "Had Samuel Wilson in here this morning. You know Sam? Drives that lumber truck for Peterson's mill." We nodded, and he continued. "Sam says he saw something cross the road in front of his truck yesterday evening, about 13 miles south of here. Described it almost exactly the way you just did." My stomach dropped. One sighting could be dismissed as imagination, mistaken identity, or a trick of the light. But 2 independent sightings, describing the same creature in the same general area, within a day of each other. "Did he get a good look at it?" Margaret asked. Doug nodded. "Said it crossed right in front of his headlights, walked across the road in 4 or 5 strides. Said what struck him most was how it moved, smooth-like, not awkward the way a bear is when it's on its hind legs. That matched exactly what we'd seen, the fluid, rolling gait that was somehow both human-like and not." "What do you think it was, Doug?" I finally spoke up. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "I've been in these woods my whole life, Rose. There are things out there that don't always make sense, things that don't fit neatly into biology textbooks." He paused. "I'm not saying I believe in monsters, but I do believe that people see things that are real, even if we can't always explain them." "Are you going to look into it?" Margaret asked. Doug nodded. "I'll get a few of the boys together, head out tomorrow morning. Check around where you saw it and where Sam had his sighting. See if we can find anything." The rest of that day passed in a blur. Margaret dropped me off at my small house on the edge of town. We'd barely spoken on the drive back, both lost in our own thoughts. Before I got out of the truck, she looked at me seriously. "Rose, maybe keep this between us for now, all right? People talk in this town." I knew what she meant. In a place like New Hazelton, word spread fast. I didn't fancy being known as the school teacher who claimed to see monsters in the woods. "I won't say anything," I promised. That night was one of the worst of my life. Every creak of my house settling, every rustle of wind in the trees outside my window had me sitting bolt upright in bed. I kept seeing those deep-set eyes watching me from the darkness. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke with a start at dawn, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. Doug Mackenzie came by the next afternoon. He looked tired, with dirt smudged on his clothes and face. "Find anything?" I asked, ushering him in and pouring him a cup of coffee. He took a long sip before answering. "Nothing definitive. No tracks, ground's too dry and hard this time of year. But," he hesitated, "we found some odd things. Broken branches along some game trails, snapped clean off at about 7 or 8 feet up, not the kind of damage bears or other wildlife make. And in a few spots, we found fur caught on rough bark. Not like any animal I'm familiar with." He didn't say more, and I didn't press him. We both knew what the implications were. In the days that followed, I heard that Doug had sent the fur samples to a university in Vancouver for analysis. I never heard what came of that. There were no more sightings reported that summer, at least none that became public knowledge. Margaret and I never spoke about what we saw again after that day. It was as if we'd made an unspoken agreement to lock the experience away. But sometimes, when we'd be together and the conversation lulled, I'd catch her staring off into the distance with a troubled look, and I knew she was thinking about it too. I stayed in New Hazelton for 2 more years before taking a teaching position in Vancouver. The official reason was better pay and opportunities, but deep down, I knew part of me just couldn't stand being so close to those woods anymore. Margaret wrote to me occasionally. She never mentioned our experience directly, but in one letter she included a newspaper clipping about strange sounds being heard at night near Fletcher's Meadow. Her only comment was a single question mark in the margin. All these years later, I still don't know what we saw that day. Science tells me it couldn't have been what the legends call Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Logic says it must have been a bear, standing unusually erect, viewed through the lens of excitement and suggestibility. But then, I remember those eyes, the intelligence in them, the way it moved with such deliberate purpose. And I know, whatever it was we saw standing at the edge of those woods in the summer of 1958, it wasn't just an animal, it was something else. Something watching us as carefully as we were watching it. And sometimes, on dark nights, when the wind rustles through the trees outside my window, I can't help but wonder, was it just curious about us? Or was it warning us away? Story 13. I'm still struggling to make sense of what happened that night. It's been over 60 years, but I remember it like it was yesterday. December 8th, 1958. A date that's burned into my memory forever. My name's George. I was 32 back then, and my hunting buddy Bert Solgel and I had been planning this trip for months. We'd been hearing stories about the excellent deer hunting up in the Bella Coola area near Burt Bridge in British Columbia. Seemed like a good omen that the place had the same name as my friend. We figured we'd try our luck there, so we invited a couple other fellas we knew from around town, James Peterson and William Thompson, to join us. It was cold as hell up there in December, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you put on. We'd set up our camp that afternoon in a small clearing surrounded by thick forest. The snow wasn't deep yet, just patches here and there, but the ground was frozen solid, made setting up the tents a real pain in the arse. By evening, we'd managed to get a decent fire going. Bert and I were sitting on one side of it, facing the tree line, while James and William had their backs to the woods. We'd had a long day of hiking and setting up camp, so we were just relaxing, drinking coffee with a splash of whiskey to keep warm, and talking about where we'd start hunting at first light. It must have been around 8 p.m. when I noticed something wasn't right. You know that feeling when you're being watched? The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I got this weird sensation in my gut. I didn't say anything at first, just casually glanced toward the tree line while pretending to warm my hands on my coffee mug. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards away, standing in some waist-high brush at the edge of the clearing, was something. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. But no, this thing was standing completely upright, natural-like, not like a bear would. And it was huge. Massive, taller than any man I'd ever seen. I nudged Bert with my elbow, trying not to make any sudden movements. "Bert," I whispered, "look over there at the edge of the clearing. Tell me what you see." Bert turned his head slowly, then froze. I heard his breath catch in his throat. The thing was just watching us, standing perfectly still among the brush. It was dark, covered in what looked like fur, with long arms hanging down past its waist. The firelight didn't reach far enough for me to make out facial features, but I could tell it had a large, rounded head set directly on broad shoulders. No neck that I could discern. I don't know how long we stared at each other, maybe only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then Bert shifted slightly, and in that instant the creature bolted. Jesus, the way it moved. I've been a hunter my whole life, seen deer and elk and bears run. Nothing moves like this thing did. In a flash it was gone over a small rise about 30 yards beyond where it had been standing. "Holy shit," Bert whispered. "Did you see that?" James and William were looking at us like we'd lost our minds. "See what?" James asked, turning around to look where we were staring. "There was something there," I said, already getting to my feet. Bert stood up too. "We need to check it out." Looking back, I don't know what possessed us to follow it. Curiosity, adrenaline, stupidity. Whatever the reason, Bert and I grabbed our flashlights and rifles and headed toward where we'd seen the creature. "You two stay here," Bert told James and William. "Keep the fire going." The brush was thick, and it was dark as pitch beyond the firelight. Our flashlight beams seemed pathetically weak against the vast darkness of the wilderness. I remember the crunch of frozen ground beneath our boots as we made our way to where the creature had been standing. We reached the spot in less than a minute. The brush was disturbed, branches broken where something large had obviously passed through. But what struck me was how little evidence there was. Whatever this thing was, it moved with a grace that seemed impossible for its size. "Look," Bert said, pointing his flashlight at the ground. There, in a small patch of snow, was a single heel print. Just one. It was huge, at least 16 inches long and deeply pressed into the snow. The impression was clear, a bare heel, much larger than any human foot I'd ever seen. "What the hell makes a track like that?" I whispered, though I already had a sinking feeling in my gut about what we might have seen. We followed in the direction it had gone, toward the rise. What we discovered was bizarre. The ground between where we'd first seen it and the rise was a mix of bare, frozen earth and scattered snow patches. But the creature had only left prints in the bare earth, faint depressions that you'd miss if you weren't looking carefully. The snow patches between these spots were completely undisturbed. "It's avoiding the snow," Bert said, shining his light across the ground. "Look at the pattern. It's deliberately stepping around the snow patches." He was right. To do that at the speed it moved would require incredible agility and intelligence. It would have needed to leap distances no human could manage, especially in the dark. We followed the trail to the rise and climbed to the top, scanning with our flashlights. Nothing. The creature had completely vanished. No more tracks, no broken branches, no sign of which direction it had gone. It was as if it had simply disappeared into thin air. "We should get back to camp," I said finally, a chill running through me that had nothing to do with the December air. When we returned, James and William were visibly tense. "What the hell was that all about?" James demanded. We told them what we'd seen. At first, they thought we were pulling their leg, trying to scare them with campfire stories. but they could see we were genuinely shaken. Neither of us was the type to spook easily. "Maybe it was just a bear," William suggested, but I could tell he didn't believe it any more than we did. "Bears don't stand like that," Bert said, "and they sure as hell don't move like that." We stayed up late talking about it, all of us a bit on edge. Eventually, we decided to take turns keeping watch through the night. None of us said it out loud, but I think we were all wondering the same thing. Would it come back? James and William took the first watch while Bert and I tried to get some sleep in our tent. I don't think either of us managed more than a light doze. Every crack of a twig or rustle of branches had us wide awake, listening intently. It must have been around 2 a.m. when we heard it, a scream unlike anything I'd ever heard before or since. It started as a low, guttural growl that rose into a high-pitched howl that seemed to echo through the entire valley. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized, and I've heard pretty much every critter in those woods. This was different, primal. It made my blood run cold. We all bolted out of our tents, rifles ready. The fire had died down to embers, and the darkness around us seemed alive with possibilities. We stood there, back to back, scanning the tree line with our flashlights. But there was nothing to see. The screams came twice more during the night, each time from a different direction, as if the thing was circling our camp. By the third scream, it sounded farther away, like it was moving off into the distance. None of us slept the rest of the night. We kept the fire built up high and sat around it with our rifles across our knees, jumping at every sound from the surrounding forest. When dawn finally broke, we were exhausted, strung out on adrenaline and fear. In the daylight, we went back to where we'd seen the creature. The heel print was still there in the snow, though it had started to melt around the edges in the morning sun. Bert took a picture of it with his camera, though I don't know whatever happened to that photo. We searched the area thoroughly, but found no other clear tracks or evidence of the creature's passage. We decided to cut our hunting trip short. None of us felt comfortable staying another night, though we didn't openly admit it was because of what we'd seen. We packed up camp and headed back to civilization, barely speaking on the drive home. When we got back, Bert and I reported what we'd seen to the local forestry office. The ranger who took our report, a grizzled old-timer named McGregor, didn't seem particularly surprised. He pulled out a map and marked the location of our sighting, adding it to what looked like several other marks in the same valley. "You boys aren't the first," he said, lighting a cigarette. "We've had reports all fall. Logging crews from up that way have been finding big footprints around their equipment and supply caches. Some of them are refusing to work certain areas." "What do you think it is?" Bert asked. McGregor shrugged. "Officially, bears, most likely. Unofficially?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Locals call it Sasquatch. The native people around here have stories going back generations about the wild men of the woods. I've been working these forests for 30 years, and I've seen things that don't make sense. Things that shouldn't exist." He took a long drag on his cigarette. "Whatever you boys saw out there, I'd suggest you keep it to yourselves unless you want people thinking you're crazy." But we didn't keep it to ourselves. Not completely. We told a few friends, who told a few more. Soon our experience became known locally as the Burt Bridge Bigfoot sighting. Some believed us, many didn't. I don't blame the skeptics. I'd have been one myself if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. In the years that followed, I returned to that area several times, hoping to see the creature again, to prove to myself I hadn't imagined it. I never did, but I've talked to others who've had similar experiences in those mountains. Too many to dismiss. I'm an old man now. Most of the people who were there that night are gone. Bert passed away in '97, James a few years after. I don't know what happened to William. We lost touch decades ago. I'm probably the last one left who remembers what happened that cold December night in 1958. I still don't know what we saw by our campfire. Was it the creature the locals call Sasquatch? Maybe. All I know for certain is that it was real, it was intelligent, and for a brief moment it was curious about us, just as we were curious about it. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, watching from the edge of some other camp's firelight, just beyond where the light fades into darkness. And sometimes on cold winter nights, when the wind howls through the trees, I swear I can still hear those screams echoing in my memory. Story 14. I never thought I'd be sharing this. For over 40 years, I've mostly kept it to myself, only telling a handful of people I trust. But I'm getting older now, and I want to put it down somewhere before I'm gone. Maybe someone out there has seen the same thing. It happened in March of 1959. I was 27 then, working as a commercial fisherman out of Prince Rupert, but I'd taken a few days off to do some hunting on one of the smaller islands in the Hecate Strait. I won't name the island specifically. Some of the guys who know the story still refuse to land there, and I don't want to add to that reputation. I'd been an outdoorsman my whole life, practically raised in the coastal wilderness of British Columbia. My dad had me handling rifles when I was 9, and I'd brought down my first deer at 12. By the time I was in my 20s, I could navigate those islands blindfolded, knew every sign of wildlife, every track, every smell. When you spend that much time in the wilderness, you develop instincts that city folk might call superstition, but anyone who's lived out there knows better. That March morning was cold but clear. I'd arranged to meet my buddies Jack and Roy at the northeastern point of the island around 4 p.m. They were coming by boat to pick me up after spending the day on another island. I'd set out at dawn, my Winchester rifle over my shoulder, dressed in heavy wool and waterproof gear. The forest was quiet that day, too quiet looking back on it, should have been my first clue. Around 2 p.m. I finally spotted a decent buck about 80 yards through the trees. Clean shot, right through the heart. He dropped instantly. I field-dressed him there, then began the laborious process of dragging the carcass to the pickup point on the shore. By about 3:30 I'd made it to the rocky beach. The deer was a good one, probably about 180 pounds. I was sweating despite the cold, so I propped my rifle against a log, set the deer down on the pebbled shore, and sat on a driftwood log to catch my breath before the boys arrived. The water was dead calm that day, barely a ripple, and the sky was starting to take on that late afternoon grey. I remember checking my watch, 3:42 p.m., and looking out across the water, hoping to spot Jack's boat. That's when I first noticed something wasn't right. The air changed. It's hard to explain unless you've spent time in the wilderness, but there was a sudden heaviness. And then the smell hit me. If you've ever been around wild animals, you know they all have their distinct odors. Bears have that musky, wet dog smell when they're close. Wolves have their own scent. This was different, powerful, like wet fur and something rotten all mixed together, but with an almost human-like sweat undertone. I'd never smelled anything like it in all my years in the wilderness. The hair on my neck stood up before my brain even processed what was happening. Pure instinct had me turning around slowly, and that's when I saw it. Just at the tree line, maybe 30 feet away, something massive was pushing through the salal bushes. At first, all I could make out was movement, something dark against the evergreens. Then it stepped partially into the open, and I felt my heart practically stop. It was tall, God, it was tall. 7 feet at minimum, maybe closer to 8, and wide too, with shoulders that would make a linebacker look small. But it wasn't a man. It was covered completely in dark hair. Not fur exactly, but long hair, dark brown or black, hanging in matted clumps. The hair on its head blended right into what covered its body. The face is what haunts me most. It wasn't fully visible, thank God for that. But what I could see looked like something between a man and an ape, with a prominent brow and a wide, flat nose. Its eyes were deep-set, watching me with an intelligence that no animal should possess. I've faced down charging bears before. I've been caught in storms at sea where I thought my boat would break apart. Nothing, absolutely nothing, has ever frozen me with fear like that moment. When it took another step forward, that paralysis broke. My rifle was propped against the log several yards away. I made a split-second calculation that I wouldn't reach it in time. The creature was between me and the forest, so my only escape route was the water. I bolted, ran straight for the shoreline, and plunged in. Let me tell you, coastal BC waters in March are lethal. Hypothermia can set in within minutes. But I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking about putting distance between me and whatever the hell that thing was. I swam frantically toward a small rocky islet about 30 yards offshore. The cold hit me like thousands of needles, stabbing every inch of my body. My clothes became waterlogged, dragging me down, but pure adrenaline kept me moving. When I reached the islet, I hauled myself up onto the rocks, gasping and shaking violently from both fear and cold. My teeth were chattering so hard I thought they might break, but I forced myself to turn around and look back at the shore. The creature had fully emerged from the trees now. It moved with a smooth gait that wasn't quite human, but definitely wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. It walked upright, with a slight stoop to its posture. Its arms hung longer than a man's would, but it didn't knuckle walk like a gorilla. It approached my deer carcass slowly, almost cautiously. I watched, shivering uncontrollably, as it crouched down beside the deer. It seemed to examine it, tilting its massive head as if curious. Then it reached out with hands. Yes, hands, not paws, and grasped the deer by the antlers. With one fluid motion that spoke of incredible strength, it lifted that 180-pound carcass like it was nothing more than a sack of flour. It stood there for a moment, deer dangling from one hand, and I swear to God, it looked directly at me. Even from that distance, I could feel its gaze locked onto mine. Not with the mindless aggression of a predator, but with something more unsettling: awareness. Then it turned and walked back toward the forest, dragging my deer behind it as effortlessly as I might carry a shopping bag. It disappeared into the trees, the undergrowth swaying closed behind it like a curtain. I stayed on that rock for what felt like hours, though my watch later told me it was only about 40 minutes. The cold was becoming dangerous. My fingers had lost feeling, and my thoughts were getting sluggish. Early signs of hypothermia. I knew I had to get back to shore or I'd die right there on that islet. Looking around desperately, I spotted a large piece of driftwood that had washed up on the little rocky outcrop. It wasn't much, just a waterlogged trunk about 6 feet long, but it was buoyant enough to help me stay afloat. I slipped back into the freezing water, clinging to that log for dear life. Using it as a makeshift paddleboard, I slowly made my way back to the shore, constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Every shadow among the trees looked like it might be hiding that creature. When I finally reached the shore, I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. My clothes were soaking wet, and the wind had picked up, cutting through me like a knife. I staggered to where I'd left my rifle, grabbed it with numb hands, and backed up against a large driftwood log where I could see in all directions. The Winchester felt reassuring in my hands, though I wondered if even a .30-06 would be enough to bring down something that size. I chambered around and waited, watching the forest edge with an intensity that made my eyes burn. Jack and Roy showed up in the boat around 4:15. I've never been so happy to see anyone in my life. They spotted me from the water and could immediately tell something was wrong. When they beached the boat, Roy ran over with a blanket while Jack kept watch, his own rifle ready. "Jesus Christ, Larry, what happened to you?" Roy asked as he wrapped the blanket around my shoulders. "You fall in or something?" I was shivering so hard I could barely get the words out. I told them what I'd seen, pointing to where the creature had disappeared with my deer. They exchanged looks that I couldn't quite read. Concern, disbelief, maybe a little fear. "Let's take a look," Jack said after a moment, holding his rifle at the ready. The three of us approached the tree line cautiously. Where the creature had emerged, we found the underbrush trampled down, and then we saw the tracks. They were footprints, unmistakably so, but unlike any I'd ever seen. They were enormous, easily 17 or 18 inches long, and had 5 distinct toes. They weren't bear tracks, I'd seen plenty of those. These were broader across the front, narrower at the heel, almost human-shaped but impossibly large. We followed the tracks and the obvious trail of broken vegetation about 50 yards into the forest before Jack suggested we turn back. "Getting dark soon," he said, and none of us argued. Truth was, none of us wanted to find what had made those tracks. There was no sign of my deer carcass, not even blood trails. Whatever that thing was, it had carried it off without dragging it. On the boat ride back to the mainland, I couldn't stop shaking, even after changing into dry clothes and wrapping up in more blankets. Roy kept trying to convince me I'd seen a bear, that fear had distorted my perception. "Bears stand up sometimes," he said, "in the right light, with the right shadows." But Jack was quieter. Later, when Roy went to check the engine, Jack leaned in close. "My grandfather told stories," he said softly. "The Tsimshian call it Ba'ush. The Haida have another name, said they've been in these islands longer than people." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The image of that creature's face, too intelligent, too aware, was burned into my mind. Word got around among the local fishermen and hunters. Most laughed it off, said I'd seen a bear, or that the cold water had made me delirious. But a few of the older guys, especially some of the indigenous fishermen I'd worked with, would just nod silently when they heard the story. The next summer, a group of us went back to that island, armed with cameras and rifles. We found nothing. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual. But something had changed about the place. It felt watched. 4 of the men refused to stay after nightfall. Over the years, I've read about similar encounters. They call them Sasquatch or Bigfoot down in the States. Scientists say they don't exist, that there's no evidence, but I know what I saw. That wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a suit. It was something else. I've never been back to that specific island, and I never will. Some mysteries are best left alone, but I still fish these waters, still hunt these forests. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the wilderness, I catch a whiff of that same strange smell, that mixture of animal musk and something almost human, and I find myself scanning the tree line, rifle at the ready. Whatever I saw that March day in 1959 is still out there, I'm sure of it, and it knows these islands far better than we ever will. Story 15. I've been hesitating to write this down for years. Even now, my hands are shaking as I type this. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in crazy stuff. I've been hunting in the mountains of British Columbia since I was a teenager, and I've always prided myself on keeping a level head. But what happened to me in the fall of 1959 in the Clinton-Lillooet area still makes my skin crawl whenever I think about it. It was late October, and I'd decided to go on a solo hunting trip. My buddies couldn't make it that weekend, but I wasn't worried. I'd hunted alone plenty of times before. The weather forecast had predicted light snow, but nothing I couldn't handle. I packed my rifle, enough supplies for 3 days, and headed out into the mountains. The first day was uneventful. I hiked about 7 miles into an area I'd never hunted before, set up camp in a small clearing, and spent the evening tracking deer. I didn't have any luck, but I wasn't too concerned. I had 2 more days to bag something. The second day is when everything changed. I woke up at dawn to a light dusting of snow on the ground. Perfect tracking conditions. After a quick breakfast of coffee and jerky, I grabbed my rifle and headed out. The forest was deadly quiet that morning. No birds chirping, no squirrels chattering, just the crunch of my boots in the fresh snow. Looking back, I should have recognized that silence for what it was, a warning. By mid-morning, I'd spotted some promising deer tracks and followed them deeper into the forest. I was maybe 4 miles from my campsite, in an area with thick pine trees and scattered stumps from old logging operations. The snow was coming down a bit heavier by then, but visibility was still good. I was moving slowly, watching for any movement ahead, when I came to a small clearing with a massive old-growth stump in the center. It must have been at least 5 feet across. That's when I saw them, these massive legs, just massive, sticking out from behind the stump. They were covered in this yellowish-brown hair, not like a bear or any animal I'd ever seen. The hair was long and stringy, almost like human hair, but coarser. The legs themselves had to be at least 3 feet long from what I could see, and thick as tree trunks. The feet were partially buried in the snow, but what I could see of them looked, I don't know how else to describe it, but human-like. Only much, much bigger. I froze completely. My rifle was in my hands, but I couldn't move, couldn't even think about raising it. Whatever this was, it hadn't noticed me yet. I could hear heavy breathing from behind the stump, slow and deep, not like an animal panting, but like deep human breaths. I don't know how long I stood there. 10 seconds. A minute. Time seemed to stretch out forever. Part of me wanted to see the rest of whatever was attached to those legs, but a much stronger part, the part that's kept me alive all these years in the wilderness, was screaming at me to back away. Very slowly I started to retreat, placing each foot carefully to avoid making noise. I'd backed up maybe 15 feet when my boot caught a branch hidden beneath the snow. The crack seemed to echo through the silent forest. The breathing behind the stump stopped instantly. I didn't stick around to see what would happen next. I turned and moved as quickly and quietly as I could through the trees, not daring to look back. I didn't run. Running makes noise, but I moved faster than I ever have in my life. Only when I was about half a mile away did I finally duck behind a thick pine and try to get my breathing under control. My heart was hammering so hard I could barely hear anything else. I sat there for what must have been 20 minutes, just listening, trying to hear if anything was following me. Nothing, just the soft whisper of snow falling through pine branches. The smart thing would have been to go straight back to camp, pack up, and get the hell out of those mountains. I know that. But I've been a hunter my whole life, and curiosity is a hard thing to shake. What had I just seen? There are no animals in British Columbia with legs like that. Bears don't have that coloring, and moose don't have that kind of hair. Whatever it was something I'd never encountered before. After sitting there for another 30 minutes with no sign of being followed, I made a decision that probably makes me sound crazy. I decided to go back. Not right away. I wasn't that stupid. I figured I'd wait a couple of hours, approach from a different direction, and see if whatever it was had left any tracks I could identify. I made a wide circle through the forest, moving slowly and stopping often to listen. The snow had picked up, but I could still see my own tracks from earlier. After about an hour of careful movement, I reached a ridge that overlooked the clearing with the stump. I laid down on my stomach and used my binoculars to scan the area. The clearing was empty. Whatever had been there was gone. Feeling a bit bolder but still cautious, I made my way down to the stump. The snow around it was disturbed, showing clear signs that something large had been there. And then I saw the tracks. They were footprints, unmistakably footprints, but they were enormous, easily 18 inches long and proportionally wide. They had 5 toes, just like a human foot, but the impression in the snow was much deeper than anything a person would make. Whatever left these tracks had to weigh hundreds of pounds. My mouth went dry as I stared at those prints. They led away from the stump in the opposite direction from where I'd been. Without even thinking about it, I started to follow them. The tracks moved through the forest in a straight line, like whatever made them knew exactly where it was going. I followed for nearly a mile, moving as quietly as possible, rifle ready. The forest began to slope downward, and I realized we were heading toward a ravine I'd crossed the day before. When I reached the edge of the ravine, the tracks just stopped. right at the edge. I looked across to the other side, which had to be at least 15 feet away. The footprints didn't appear on the other side. I stood there, baffled. Had it climbed down into the ravine? I peered over the edge, but it was steep and deep, at least a 40-foot drop to a rocky stream below. No sign of anything down there. The only explanation was that whatever left those tracks had somehow jumped across the entire ravine, a leap no human or known animal could possibly make. I carefully examined the area around the last footprint. The snow at the very edge was compressed, like something had pushed off from there with tremendous force. I sat down on a fallen log, trying to process what I was seeing. What kind of creature could make that jump? It was impossible. I don't remember much about my hike back to camp. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I kept my rifle ready the whole way, jumping at every sound in the forest. That night in my tent, I barely slept. I kept imagining those massive yellowish-brown legs outside, those huge feet crushing the snow as they approached. The next morning I packed up camp at first light and hiked back to my truck as fast as I could. I needed to talk to someone who might know what I'd encountered. 2 days later, after getting back to civilization and trying to calm my nerves, I drove to the ranger station. I'd heard that Thomas Wilson, the local forest ranger, had been in these mountains for decades. If anyone would know what I might have seen, it would be him. I felt ridiculous walking into his office, about to tell him I'd seen some kind of giant hairy creature in the woods. He'd think I was crazy or drunk. But I had to know. Wilson was an older guy, maybe in his 60s, with weathered skin and sharp eyes. I introduced myself and hesitantly started explaining what I'd seen in the mountains. I expected him to laugh or roll his eyes, but instead he listened intently, occasionally nodding. When I finished, he didn't say anything for a moment. Then he got up, walked to a cabinet, and pulled out a cardboard box. From it, he removed several plaster casts and placed them on his desk. "These look familiar?" he asked. I felt the blood drain from my face. The casts were of footprints exactly like the ones I'd found. 18 inches long, 5 toes, the same distinctive shape. "Where did you get these?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Logging camp about 20 miles east of where you were hunting," Wilson said. "Found them about 3 weeks ago. The loggers reported seeing something big moving through the trees at dusk. When they went to check it out the next morning, they found these." I picked up one of the casts, feeling its weight in my hands. "What made these?" Wilson shrugged. "Officially, unknown. Large animal, species unidentified. Unofficially." He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "You're not the first person to report something like this season. Had 3 other reports in the last 2 months." "Reports of what exactly?" I asked. "Large, upright creature, much bigger than a man, and all 3 mentioned the same unusual yellowish-brown hair you described." I sat down heavily in the chair across from his desk. "So what is it?" "Don't know," Wilson said simply. "Sent photos of the cast to some wildlife biologists in Vancouver. They said there's no known animal in this region that would leave tracks like these." We talked for another hour. Wilson showed me a map with the locations of the other sightings marked. They formed a rough circle about 40 miles across, with my sighting near the western edge. All in remote areas, all by experienced outdoorsmen. Before I left, Wilson asked me if I'd be willing to go back up there with him and a couple of other rangers to look for more evidence. I said no. Maybe that makes me a coward, but I couldn't face those mountains again. Not with the knowledge that something was out there, something that shouldn't exist. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I saw that day. Maybe it was a bear standing oddly. Maybe the tracks were some elaborate hoax. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me in the snow. But deep down, I know what I saw. Those massive legs, that yellowish-brown hair, those impossible footprints leading to a jump no known creature could make. Wilson retired a few years later, and I heard he took all his records and casts with him. I tried looking into other sightings in that area over the years, but most of what I found seemed like tall tales or second-hand stories that had been exaggerated. I still hunt, but never alone, and never in the Clinton-Lillooet area. Sometimes when I'm in the wilderness and the forest goes quiet, I remember that silence from 1959, and I scan the trees, half expecting to see those massive legs again. I don't know what's out there in those mountains. I just know that whatever I saw that day wasn't supposed to exist. And it's been haunting me for over 60 years now. Every time I close my eyes, I can still see those huge footprints in the snow leading to the edge of that ravine. And then, nothing.